Hey guys, tonight you begin a journey into one of the darkest corners of royal history, a world where the closest bond imaginable, sisterhood, was shattered by something even more powerful, the desperate hunger for a crown. You are going to witness 11 moments when royal sisters, women who shared the same blood, the same childhood, often the same nursery and the same tutors, turned against each other with a viciousness that would shock even the most cynical observers of palace intrigue. These weren't strangers competing for power. These were sisters who had once held hands, shared secrets, perhaps even promised to protect each other forever. And yet, when a throne came between them, those promises dissolved like morning mist, replaced by plots, poison, betrayal, and in some cases cold-blooded murder. Before we dive into these tragic stories of sisterly betrayal, I'd love it if you could hit that subscribe button. It really helps me continue creating these bedtime history stories for you. I am genuinely curious. Where are you right now? Are you tucked in bed, perhaps thinking about your own siblings and grateful that your family conflicts don't involve crowns and executioners? Are you relaxing on the couch, ready for a deep dive into the complicated psychology of power and family? Wherever you are, dim those lights, get comfortable, and let's explore what happens when the two most powerful forces in human nature, family loyalty and the desire for power, collide with devastating consequences. What if you discovered that throughout history some of the most brutal betrayals didn't happen between enemies on battlefields but between sisters in palaces? What if you learned that the sister you played with as a child, the one who knew all your secrets and fears, could become your most dangerous enemy, simply because you were both born royal? What if you realized that being a princess wasn't a fairy tale of ball gowns and happily ever afters, but often a deadly game where the prize was a crown, and the cost could be your sister's life or your own? According to research by Professor Lisa Hilton from the University of London, whose work on royal women examines their political agency and rivalries, sisterly relationships in royal families were uniquely complicated because sisters were simultaneously natural allies and potential rivals. Professor Hilton's analysis of hundreds of royal families across European and Asian history reveals that sisters often formed powerful political alliances when their interests aligned, but could become mortal enemies when succession laws, marriage alliances, or factional politics put them in opposition. The letters, diaries, and historical records that Professor Hilton has studied show that royal sisters understood the precariousness of their position, close enough to power to desire it, but often excluded from it by laws that favoured brothers or older sisters, creating a pressure cooker of ambition, jealousy, and frustrated potential. Think about that for a moment. You are going to spend tonight exploring 11 cases where that pressure cooker exploded, where sisters who should have been each other's greatest supporters became each other's destroyers. This isn't going to be a simple catalogue of palace gossip, though gossip and scandal are certainly part of these stories. This is going to be an exploration of what power does to human relationships, how the accident of birth order or gender can turn love into hate, how the structure of monarchy itself created situations where sisters had to choose between family loyalty and personal ambition, and how that choice played out in ways that were sometimes tragic, sometimes shocking, and always revealing about human nature at its most conflicted. Let me tell you about Cleopatra VII and Arsinoe IV of Egypt, because their story of sisterly betrayal in the dying days of Ptolemaic Egypt reveals how quickly family bonds could dissolve in the face of political necessity. According to research by Professor Duane Roller from Ohio State University, whose biography of Cleopatra examines her family relationships, Cleopatra and Arsinoe were two of the children of Ptolemy the Turt, growing up in the chaotic Alexandria court where poisonings, assassinations, and sibling warfare were practically family traditions. The Ptolemaic dynasty ruling Egypt as the last remnant of Alexander the Great's empire had a long history of brothers marrying sisters and siblings murdering each other for power. So Cleopatra and Arsinoe grew up knowing that family love was always conditional, always subordinate to political survival. When Ptolemy the Threat died in 51 BCE, according to Professor Roller's analysis of ancient sources, including Plutarch and Dio Cassius, 18-year-old Cleopatra initially ruled jointly with her younger brother Ptolemy III, as was Egyptian custom. Arsinoe, roughly 15 at the time, was initially just another sister in a complicated family, not yet a direct threat to Cleopatra's power. But when civil war erupted between Cleopatra and Ptolemy III in 48 BCE, everything changed. Arsinoe saw an opportunity, and according to Professor Roller, she seized it with a ruthlessness that suggests she had learned well from her family's bloody history. She declared herself queen, aligned with her brother Ptolemy III against Cleopatra, and positioned herself as the legitimate ruler of Egypt, casting Cleopatra as a usurper who had become too close to Rome and Julius Caesar. Picture the scene that unfolded in Alexandria in 48 BCE. Two sisters, both claiming to be the rightful queen of Egypt, both commanding armies, both willing to see the other dead rather than share power. According to Professor Roller, Arsinoe didn't just oppose Cleopatra politically, she actively tried to have her killed, supporting military campaigns against her sister and positioning herself as the alternative for Egyptians who resented Cleopatra's alliance with Caesar. For a brief period, according to ancient sources analysed by Professor Roller, Arsinoe actually seemed to be winning, with significant support from the Egyptian army and from factions in Alexandria who preferred a queen who wasn't so closely tied to Roman power. But Cleopatra had Julius Caesar on her side, and according to Professor Roller's account based on ancient sources, when Caesar's forces defeated the Egyptian army in 47 BCE, Arsinoe was captured and dragged through the streets of Rome in Caesar's triumph, paraded as a defeated enemy and living trophy of Caesar's conquest. You can imagine the humiliation, a teenage queen, sister to the woman who had allied with Rome's most powerful man, displayed in chains before jeering Roman crowds. Ancient sources say that the Romans actually felt pity for Arsinoe because she was so young and appeared so vulnerable, a rare moment of sympathy in Roman triumphs that usually celebrated captives' degradation. But Cleopatra's revenge didn't end with Arsinoe's humiliation in Rome. According to Professor Roller, Caesar eventually released Arsinoe and allowed her to live in exile at the Temple of Artemis in Ephesus, perhaps out of that same Roman sympathy, or perhaps because he didn't consider a teenage girl enough of a threat to execute. Cleopatra, however, never forgot and never forgave her sister's betrayal. Years later, in 41 BCE, when Cleopatra had secured her position as queen and had formed a new alliance with Mark Antony, she sent assassins to Ephesus. They found Arsinoe in the temple, a sacred space where she should have been protected by religious law, and murdered her on the temple steps, according to Professor Roller's analysis of ancient sources. Cleopatra had her own sister executed, violating the sacred sanctuary of one of the ancient world's most revered temples, simply to eliminate any potential rival who might someday challenge her power. Think about that level of ruthlessness. Arsinoe was living in exile, far from Egypt, no longer a realistic threat to Cleopatra's throne. But Cleopatra had learned the lesson that her Ptolemaic ancestors had taught through generations of family murder. You don't leave potential rivals alive, even if they're your own sisters, even if they're living in religious sanctuary halfway across the Mediterranean. According to Professor Roller, Cleopatra's decision to have Arsinoe murdered demonstrates the calculating pragmatism that characterized her entire reign. Family sentiment was a luxury she couldn't afford, and any sister who had once challenged her power had to die, regardless of how pathetic or unthreatening they might appear in exile. Now let me tell you about Queen Mary I and Princess Elizabeth of England, because their relationship reveals a different kind of sisterly betrayal, slower, more psychological, driven as much by religious conflict and political pressure as by personal animosity. According to research by Professor Anna Whitelock from Royal Holloway University of London, whose work on Tudor women examines their relationships, Mary and Elizabeth were half-sisters separated by 17 years and by the catastrophic history of their father Henry VIII's marriages. Mary was the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, raised Catholic, traumatized by her mother's humiliation and by being declared a bastard when Henry divorced Catherine. Elizabeth was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, raised Protestant, always carrying the stain of being the child of the woman whose marriage to Henry had destroyed Mary's mother's life and England's relationship with the Catholic Church. You can imagine the complexity of their relationship even before either became queen. According to Professor Whitelock's analysis of letters and historical records, Mary initially tried to be kind to baby Elizabeth, recognizing that the child wasn't responsible for her parents' actions. Some accounts suggest that Mary even showed affection for her little half-sister when they were young. But as Elizabeth grew older and as the religious divisions in England, that affection curdled into suspicion and fear. Mary knew that Elizabeth represented everything she opposed: Protestantism, the Boleyn faction, the religious changes that had devastated Mary's life and that of her mother. And worse, Mary knew that Protestant England saw Elizabeth as the rightful heir, the younger sister who represented the future, while Mary represented a return to the Catholic past that many English people had rejected. When Mary became queen in 1553, according to Professor Whitelock, she was already suspicious of Elizabeth, but she tried to maintain sisterly relations, even inviting Elizabeth to court and treating her with outward honour. But the political reality was impossible to ignore. Every Protestant plot against Mary's throne, every whisper of rebellion, every suggestion of replacing Mary with a Protestant monarch centred on Elizabeth. Whether Elizabeth actively encouraged these plots or not, her mere existence as Mary's Protestant half-sister made her the natural focal point for everyone who opposed Mary's Catholic restoration. According to Professor Whitelock, this created an impossible situation where Elizabeth didn't even have to do anything wrong to be guilty. Her religious identity and her position in the succession made her an automatic threat. In 1554, according to Professor Whitelock's account based on historical sources, Mary finally arrested Elizabeth and imprisoned her in the Tower of London, the same fortress where their mother Anne Boleyn had been executed 18 years earlier. Elizabeth must have been terrified, knowing that her sister had the power to execute her, and that many of Mary's Catholic advisors were urging exactly that. For 2 months, Elizabeth was held in the Tower while Mary's council debated her fate. Some of Mary's advisors argued that Elizabeth should be executed as a traitor, pointing to her likely involvement in Protestant plots against the Queen. Others argued that executing a princess of the blood with no clear proof of treason would turn her into a Protestant martyr and create more problems than it solved. According to Professor Whitelock, Mary was genuinely torn. Part of her, the part that remembered Elizabeth as a little girl, the part that was still her father's daughter and recognised some family obligation, didn't want to execute her half-sister. But another part of Mary, the part that had been traumatised by her mother's suffering, and that saw Elizabeth as the embodiment of everything wrong with England, wanted Elizabeth dead. In the end, according to Professor Whitelock, Mary chose a middle path that was perhaps more cruel than simple execution. She released Elizabeth from the Tower, but kept her under house arrest for months, isolated from the court, always under suspicion, never knowing if each day might be her last. This psychological torture, the constant fear, the isolation, the knowledge that her sister could order her death at any moment, may have shaped Elizabeth's character more than any other experience of her youth. Mary never executed Elizabeth, but according to Professor Whitelock, she never fully trusted her either, and she refused to name Elizabeth as her heir almost until her dying day, desperately hoping that she might somehow produce a Catholic child who would continue her religious policies and keep England Catholic. When Mary finally reluctantly acknowledged Elizabeth as her heir on her deathbed in 1558, it was a defeat, an admission that everything she had fought for would be undone by the Protestant sister she had tried so hard to control. Elizabeth, for her part, became queen and quickly dismantled Mary's Catholic restoration. returning England to Protestantism and effectively erasing her sister's legacy. She never spoke warmly of Mary in public, never honoured her memory, and allowed her sister to be remembered as Bloody Mary, the fanatic who burned Protestants, while Elizabeth became Good Queen Bess, the glorious Protestant ruler who defeated Spain and brought England into its golden age. Think about the tragic irony of that relationship. Mary and Elizabeth could have been allies, could have supported each other as royal women navigating a male-dominated world. But their father's marital chaos, the religious divisions that tore England apart, and the political machinations of factions that saw them as tools rather than people, turned them into enemies. Mary couldn't trust Elizabeth because of what she represented, and Elizabeth couldn't forgive Mary for the years of fear and imprisonment. Neither sister betrayed the other in the simple sense of plotting murder or seizing power by force, but they betrayed the possibility of sisterhood, the chance to build a relationship based on something other than suspicion and fear. Let me tell you about the Mughal sisters Roshanara and Jahanara, princesses of 17th century India, whose rivalry over their brother's throne reveals how succession politics could turn sisters into bitter enemies even when they weren't competing for the crown themselves. According to research by Professor Ruby Lal from Emory University, whose work on Mughal women examines their political agency, Roshanara and Jahanara were daughters of the Mughal Emperor Shah Jahan, growing up in unimaginable luxury in the most powerful and wealthiest court in the world. They were educated, cultivated, powerful in their own right as Mughal princesses, and they had every reason to be close allies, both as sisters and as royal women navigating the complex politics of the Mughal court. But according to Professor Lal's analysis of Mughal chronicles and court records, the sisters chose different sides in the brutal succession war that erupted among their brothers in the 1650s. Jahanara, the older sister, supported their brother Dara Shikoh, the designated heir who was cultured, religiously tolerant, interested in Hindu-Muslim synthesis, and favoured by their father Shah Jahan. Roshanara supported a different brother, Aurangzeb, who was orthodox, militant, ambitious, and determined to seize power, even if it meant going to war against his own father and brothers. The choice wasn't just about which brother to support. It was about what kind of empire the Mughals would become, what relationship Islam would have to the empire's Hindu majority, and what the future of one of the world's great civilizations would look like. According to Professor Lal, Roshanara didn't just passively support Aurangzeb, she actively aided his conspiracy against their father and other brothers. Mughal sources suggest that Roshanara acted as a spy in the royal household, passing information to Aurangzeb about their father's plans, their brother Dara's movements, and the loyalties of various nobles. She used her position as a princess with access to the inner palace, where men couldn't go, to gather intelligence that proved crucial to Aurangzeb's eventual victory. When Aurangzeb imprisoned their elderly father Shah Jahan in 1658 and began systematically hunting down and executing their brothers, Roshanara supported these actions, seeing them as necessary for Aurangzeb's consolidation of power and for the religious vision of the empire that they shared. Jahanara, by contrast, according to Professor Lal, remained loyal to their father and tried desperately to protect their brother Dara. When Aurangzeb finally captured Dara in 1659, Jahanara begged for his life, pleaded with Aurangzeb to show mercy to their brother. But Aurangzeb, perhaps with Roshanara's encouragement, showed no mercy. He had Dara paraded through the streets of Delhi in chains, humiliated before the public, and then executed as a heretic and traitor. Jahanara spent the rest of her life in voluntary confinement with their imprisoned father, caring for Shah Jahan until his death in 1666, never forgiving Aurangzeb or Roshanara for destroying their family. The ultimate betrayal, according to Professor Lal's analysis, was Roshanara's willingness to sacrifice family unity and even family members' lives for political and religious ideology. She helped Aurangzeb destroy their brothers, imprison their father, and break their sister's heart. all because she believed in Aurangzeb's vision for the empire, and because supporting him gave her more power and influence than she would have had under Dara's more inclusive regime. When Roshanara died in 1671, according to Mughal records, she was buried in an unmarked grave in Delhi, eventually forgotten by history, while Jahanara, who had stayed loyal to family and to her father, was honoured and remembered. Professor Lal notes the irony that Roshanara's betrayal of her family, which she may have thought would secure her legacy, instead condemned her to historical obscurity, while the sister she opposed became celebrated for her loyalty and compassion. Now let me tell you about the Byzantine princesses Zodiadora Porphyrogenita, because their relationship in 11th century Constantinople demonstrates how sisters could shift between alliance and enmity, depending on political circumstances, sometimes betraying, always calculating. According to research by Professor Leonora Neville from the University of Wisconsin, whose work on Byzantine women examines their political strategies, Zoe and Theodora were the last of the Macedonian dynasty, born in the purple chamber of the imperial palace, and therefore technically entitled to rule, but constantly frustrated by Byzantine prejudices against female rule and by political factions that wanted to control them rather than let them exercise independent power. You could imagine their complicated relationship from childhood. According to Professor Neville's analysis of Byzantine chronicles, including those of Michael Psellos, who knew both sisters personally, Zotora were different in temperament and ambition. Zor was beautiful, sensual, interested in men and romance, always hoping that the right marriage would bring her real power. Theodora was serious, devout, uninterested in romance, and according to Psellos's rather misogynistic account, mannish in her demeanour and interests. The sisters were rivals for their father Constantine VIII's affection and for position at court, but they were also potential allies against the various men who tried to control them through marriage or manipulation. Their first major betrayal of each other came in 1028, according to Professor Neville's account based on Byzantine sources. Their father Constantine VIII was dying, and he needed to secure the succession. Byzantine law allowed women to inherit, but Constantine was deeply reluctant to leave the empire to his unmarried daughters. At the last minute, according to the sources, he arranged for Zoe, then about 50 years old, to marry Romanos Argyros, an elderly senator. Zoe agreed, became empress, and then, and here is the betrayal, Zoe allowed her new husband to force Theodora into a convent, effectively removing her from political life and potential succession. Theodora was compelled to become a nun, her hair cut, her imperial robes replaced with monastic garb, all her political prospects destroyed, while her sister ruled as empress alongside Romanos. Think about that betrayal. Theodora was Zoe's only full sibling, the only person who truly understood what it meant to be a Macedonian princess, and Zoe sacrificed her to secure her own marriage and position as empress. For 13 years, according to Professor Neville, Theodora lived in a convent, her life of prayer and isolation a stark contrast to the imperial luxury she had been born to. While Zoe ruled badly, most sources agree, alongside husbands who treated her more as a legitimating device than as a true partner. But the story doesn't end there, because Byzantine politics had a way of creating unexpected reversals. In 1042, according to Professor Neville, the Byzantine army revolted against Zoe, and her third husband Michael, third Zoe, had a complicated marital history. Michael V had tried to force Zoe into a convent, repeating what had been done to Theodora, but the people of Constantinople rioted in defence of their Macedonian empress, and in that moment of crisis, the crowd demanded not just Zoe's restoration, but Theodora's as well. Theodora was dragged from her convent, still wearing her nun's habit, and proclaimed co-empress alongside her sister. For several months in 1042, according to Professor Neville's analysis of the sources, Zoe and Theodora ruled jointly as Byzantine empresses, the only time in Byzantine history when two women ruled as equals without a male co-emperor. It should have been their moment of triumph, a vindication of the Macedonian dynasty and of female rule. But according to Psellos, who witnessed this period personally, the sisters couldn't cooperate. They quarrelled constantly over administrative decisions, over court appointments, over everything. Theodora had not forgotten being forced into a convent, and Zoe resented having to share power after decades as the senior empress. Within a few months, according to Professor Neville, Zoe married yet again, making her new husband Constantine Monomachos emperor, and Theodora was once again marginalised, though at least she wasn't forced back into the convent. The final twist came in 1050, according to Professor Neville, when Zoe died and Theodora, now about 70 years old, finally got her chance to rule alone. For the last year and a half of her life, Theodora ruled as sole empress, proving remarkably capable and energetic despite her age. According to the Byzantine sources, she died in 1056, the last of the Macedonian dynasty, having outlived the sister who had betrayed her and having finally achieved the power that should have been hers all along. Professor Neville notes the poignancy of this. Theodora spent most of her life as a victim of others' ambitions, including her sisters. But in the end, she was the one who proved capable of real rule, while Zoe, for all her beauty and marriages, never achieved effective power. Let me tell you about the Stuart princesses Mary and Anne, because their relationship in late 17th and early 18th century England reveals how political and religious pressures could fracture even the closest sisterly bonds. According to research by Professor Rachel Weil from Cornell University, whose work on Stuart women examines their political agency, Mary and Anne were daughters of James II, who would later be deposed in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. The sisters grew up close, sharing Protestant tutors and education, despite their father's Catholicism, writing affectionate letters to each other, genuinely seeming to care about each other, in ways that the historical record doesn't always show between royal sisters. But according to Professor Weil's analysis of letters and state papers, their relationship began to fracture under the political pressures of the late 1680s. Their father, James II, was Catholic and was trying to re-Catholicize England, which terrified Protestant England and created an impossible situation for his Protestant daughters. When Mary married William of Orange in 1677, she left England for the Netherlands, but she and Anne maintained a warm correspondence, addressing each other as Dear Lemon and Dear Orange in their letters, using food-themed nicknames that suggest the playfulness and affection of their relationship. Everything changed in 1688 when Protestant leaders invited Mary's husband William to invade England and depose their father James II. According to Professor Weil, Mary faced an agonizing choice: support her husband's invasion and betray her father, or remain loyal to her father and oppose her husband. She chose William, and Anne, still in England, also sided against their father, refusing to support James II's Catholic policies and eventually joining William and Mary's side. Together, the sisters betrayed their father, helping to drive him into exile and taking his crown. Mary became queen alongside William, and Anne became the heir after Mary. You might think that this shared betrayal of their father would have bound the sisters together, but according to Professor Weil, the opposite happened. Once Mary was queen, the relationship deteriorated rapidly. The problem was Sarah Churchill, Anne's closest friend and favourite, who Mary and William distrusted as a political schemer. William and Mary demanded that Anne dismiss Sarah from her household. Anne refused, seeing it as an attack on her independence and on her right to choose her own friends and attendants. What started as a dispute over a favourite became a total breakdown of the sisterly relationship. According to Professor Weil's analysis of letters from this period, Mary and Anne stopped speaking to each other. When they encountered each other at court, they refused to acknowledge each other. Mary denied Anne adequate financial settlement and tried to limit her political influence. The sisters, who had once been Dear Lemon and Dear Orange, became bitter enemies, communicating only through intermediaries, each feeling betrayed by the other. Mary feeling that Anne was putting friendship above family and political necessity, Anne feeling that Mary was trying to control and humiliate her. The breach was never healed. Mary died in 1694, only 6 years after becoming queen, and according to historical accounts, Anne was not allowed to see her dying sister, was not present at her deathbed, and felt genuine grief mixed with resentment that they had wasted their last years in enmity. When Anne became queen in 1702, according to Professor Weil, she tried to honour Mary's memory publicly, but she also systematically dismantled some of Mary's policies and promoted people that Mary and William had opposed. The ultimate tragedy, according to Professor Weil, is that both sisters were victims of a political system that set them against each other, first against their father, then against each other, and neither was able to prioritise sisterhood over political survival. They betrayed their father together, but that shared betrayal poisoned their relationship rather than strengthening it, proving that sometimes the bonds of family are not strengthened but destroyed by political crisis. Now, let me tell you about the Borgia sisters, because while Lucrezia Borgia is the famous one, her relationship with her half-sister offers a glimpse into Renaissance Italian family politics at its most dysfunctional, according to research by Professor Sarah Bradford, whose biography of Lucrezia examines Borgia family dynamics. Lucrezia had several half-siblings from her father Pope Alexander various relationships, and the relationships among these siblings were characterized by competition for their father's favor and for position in the complicated Borgia power structure. While Lucrezia herself is more famous for her relationships with her brothers, particularly Caesar, her interactions with female relatives reveal the particular challenges that Borgia women faced in trying to secure their positions in a family where power was everything and sentiment meant nothing. Think about what it meant to be a Borgia daughter in the late 15th century. Your father was the Pope, theoretically celibate but openly acknowledging his children and using them as political tools. Your legitimacy was always questionable. Your position dependent entirely on your father's power and whim. Your brothers had military careers and territorial ambitions. You, as a woman, had marriage as your only political asset, and you could be married and divorced repeatedly as your family's political needs changed. In this environment, according to Professor Bradford, sibling relationships were transactional at best and actively hostile at worst. Let me tell you about Princess Sophia Dorothea and her half-sisters in the House of Hanover, because their story reveals how illegitimate and legitimate siblings could become enemies in 18th century royal courts. According to research by Professor Andrew Thompson from the University of Exeter, whose work on the Hanoverians examines court politics, the Electoral Court of Hanover was characterized by sexual intrigue and family dysfunction that would have shocked even by the relaxed moral standards of 18th century royalty. Sophia Dorothea was the legitimate wife of the electoral Prince George Louis, who would become King George I of Britain, but George Louis had numerous mistresses who produced illegitimate children who hung around the court, creating complicated family dynamics. The most notorious situation, according to Professor Thompson, involved not sisters by blood but the wives and mistresses of Hanoverian men, who often became rivals in ways that paralleled sisterly competition. But there were also cases of legitimate and illegitimate daughters of Hanoverian electors, competing for resources, marriages, and positions at court. The illegitimate daughters, according to Professor Thompson's analysis of court records, often received surprisingly generous treatment, being married to nobles and given financial support, which created resentment among legitimate daughters who felt that their half-sisters were being rewarded for their mother's sexual relationships, while the legitimate daughters were taken for granted. Let me tell you about the daughters of Peter the Great of Russia, because the relationships among Anna, Elizabeth, and their half-sisters reveal the chaos of the Russian succession after Peter's death. According to research by Professor Lindsay Hughes from the University of London, whose work on Peter the Great examines his family, Peter had children by both his first wife Eudoxia and his second wife Catherine, creating two sets of half-siblings with competing claims to the Russian throne and fundamentally different visions for Russia's future. When Peter died in 1725 without clearly designating an heir, according to Professor Hughes, the result was decades of succession crises, palace coups, and conflict among his descendants. His daughter, Anna, from his first marriage, had a son who some felt should inherit, while his daughter Elizabeth, from his second marriage to Catherine, represented a different faction. The relationships among Peter's daughters and granddaughters was characterized by deep suspicion and political maneuvering, with each trying to secure her own position and that of her children. Elizabeth's ultimate betrayal came in 1741, according to Professor Hughes, when she staged a military coup against the infant Emperor Ivan V and his mother Anna Leopoldovna, who was Peter the Great's great-niece. Elizabeth imprisoned the baby emperor and his parents, effectively destroying an entire branch of the family to secure her own claim to the throne. While Anna Leopoldovna wasn't technically Elizabeth's sister, she was close enough in the complicated web of the Romanov family, and Elizabeth's treatment of her, imprisoning her for life along with her small children, demonstrated the ruthlessness that even female rulers could display toward female relatives when power was at stake. Let me tell you about Marie Antoinette and her sisters, because while Marie Antoinette is famous for her fate in revolutionary France, her relationships with her sisters back in Austria reveal the complicated emotions of family ties stretched across European politics. According to research by Professor Antonia Fraser, whose biography of Marie Antoinette examines her correspondence with her family, Marie Antoinette maintained regular contact with her sisters, especially Maria Carolina, who became Queen of Naples, through letters that were affectionate but also politically fraught. The betrayal here was more subtle than outright opposition. According to Professor Fraser's analysis of the letters, Marie Antoinette's Austrian family, including her sisters, expected her to serve Austrian interests in France, to influence her husband King Louis XVI to support Austrian diplomatic goals, essentially to be a spy and agent for Austria within the French court. Marie Antoinette struggled with this expectation, trying to balance her loyalty to her birth family with her responsibilities to her adopted country. Her sisters, particularly Maria Carolina, sometimes pressured her to take positions or support policies that were contrary to French interests, putting Marie Antoinette in impossible situations where any choice would mean betraying someone. The most painful aspect, according to Professor Fraser, was that when Marie Antoinette faced the revolution and needed help, her Austrian family, including her sisters, did very little to save her. They made diplomatic gestures, but they didn't risk significant political capital or resources to rescue their sister from the revolutionary tribunal. Maria Carolina, safe in Naples, wrote letters expressing grief and outrage at Marie Antoinette's fate, but she didn't marshal the resources that might have made a difference. In the end, Marie Antoinette died feeling that she had sacrificed for her Austrian family's interests her entire life, and when she needed them, they had abandoned her. Let me tell you about the daughters of Nicholas I of Russia, because their relationships reveal how even in the 19th century, when one might expect more modern family relations, royal sisters could still be pitted against each other by court politics and succession questions. According to research by Professor W. Bruce Lincoln, whose work on the Romanovs examines Nicholas I's family, Nicholas had several daughters who were married off to various European princes and grand dukes, creating a network of Romanov women across European courts. The competition among these sisters, according to Professor Lincoln, was less about direct power than about influence, precedence, and the allocation of imperial resources. Sisters competed for their father's attention and favour, for the best marriage alliances for their own children, for financial settlements from the imperial treasury, when one sister's husband was appointed to a prestigious position, or when one sister received a particularly valuable piece of jewellery or estate. Other sisters felt slighted and betrayed. Court records and family letters analysed by Professor Lincoln show constant squabbling over matters that seem petty, but that represented real political and economic stakes in the imperial system. Now, let me tell you about the complexity of defining betrayal between royal sisters, because as you've heard these stories tonight, you might have noticed that betrayal takes many forms. According to research by Professor Clarissa Campbell-Orr from Anglia Ruskin University, whose work on royal women examines their political strategies, what constitutes betrayal in royal families is often ambiguous. Is it betrayal when a sister chooses political survival over family loyalty? Is it betrayal when a sister supports a brother or husband against another sister? Is it betrayal when a sister simply competes for resources or marriages in a system that sets all royal children in competition with each other? Professor Campbell-Orr argues that we need to understand these stories in their historical context, recognizing that royal women often had very limited options, and that their betrayals were sometimes the only ways they could secure any power or protection for themselves and their children. The system of monarchy itself, with its emphasis on birth order, legitimate versus illegitimate birth, and male preference, created situations where siblings were natural rivals, even when they might have preferred to be allies. Royal sisters who betrayed each other were often responding to impossible situations where all choices involved betraying someone: a sister, a brother, a parent, a husband, or one's own ambitions and sense of self. Think about the psychological impact of growing up knowing that your sister might be your greatest enemy, that the person who should be your natural ally and confidant might someday have to destroy you or be destroyed by you to survive. According to research by Professor Pauline Stafford from the University of Liverpool, whose work on medieval queens examines family dynamics, many royal women developed sophisticated strategies for navigating these dangerous relationships, forming alliances when possible, maintaining surface friendliness even when they were rivals, and carefully calculating when to cooperate and when to compete. Let me tell you about how these betrayals were remembered and recorded, because the stories we have of royal sisters betraying each other come to us filtered through chronicles and histories written mostly by men, often with their own political agendas. According to research by Professor Elena Woodacre from the University of Winchester, whose work on queens and queenship examines historical sources, we should be skeptical about taking at face value every accusation of sisterly betrayal recorded in historical sources. Male chroniclers, according to Professor Woodacre, often emphasized conflict between royal women while downplaying their cooperation and political competence, portraying them as emotional, irrational, and prone to personal feuds, even when they were actually engaging in sophisticated political strategy. Some betrayals that chroniclers described as driven by feminine spite or jealousy, according to Professor Woodacre's analysis, were actually rational political decisions based on careful calculation of interests and risks. When a sister opposed her sister, it might have been because they genuinely represented different political factions with incompatible goals, not because of personal animosity or petty jealousy. But male writers, according to Professor Woodacre, often reduced complex political conflicts between royal women to simple emotional dramas, missing or deliberately obscuring the real political sophistication of these women's actions. At the same time, Professor Woodacre notes we shouldn't overcorrect and deny that genuine betrayal and genuine animosity existed between some royal sisters. The historical sources, even when filtered through biased chroniclers, preserve evidence of real cruelty, real violence, and real emotional damage between sisters. The challenge is to read these sources critically, asking what political stakes underlay personal conflicts, how much agency each woman actually had in the situations described, and what factors beyond personal relationship quality, things like succession law, religious conflict, factional politics, and the structural constraints of monarchy, shaped how sisters related to each other. Let me tell you about the lessons we might draw from these 11 stories of royal sisters betraying each other According to research by Professor Carol Levin from the University of Nebraska, whose work on early modern queenship examines power and family, one key lesson is that political systems that concentrate vast power in hereditary monarchy, while providing no clear consistent rules for succession, create conditions for family tragedy. When the stakes are absolute power and the rules are ambiguous, family members become enemies almost by necessity. The sisters you've heard about tonight weren't uniquely cruel or treacherous. They were responding to a system that made betrayal a rational survival strategy. Another lesson, according to Professor Levin, is about the particular vulnerability of royal women in patriarchal political system. Unlike their brothers who might compete for power directly through military prowess or political coalition building, royal sisters often had to compete indirectly through marriages, through factional alliances, through influence over male relatives. This indirect competition could be even more vicious than direct conflict because it relied on manipulation, deception, and the destruction of reputations, weapons that were sometimes the only ones available to women in societies that denied them direct political power. But Professor Levin also notes examples of royal sisters who did manage to support each other, who chose alliance over competition, who found ways to cooperate even in systems designed to set them against each other. These examples are less dramatic and therefore less often recorded in historical sources that prefer conflict and betrayal to cooperation and mutual support. But they existed, and they suggest that sisterly solidarity was possible even in royal families, though it required extraordinary political skill and often personal sacrifice to maintain. Think about what you've learned tonight about power and family, about the ways that political structures can corrupt even the closest relationships, about how people make impossible choices when all options involve betrayal of someone they should love. The 11 stories you've heard are specific to monarchy and to particular historical moments, but they reveal something universal about human nature under pressure, about what happens when we're forced to choose between personal loyalty and survival, about the psychology of betrayal and its aftermath. According to research by Professor Estelle Parank from the University of London, whose work on royal women examines their cultural representations, stories of royal sisters betraying each other have fascinated audiences for centuries, precisely because they dramatize our own family conflicts writ large. We may not be competing for thrones, but we understand sibling rivalry. The pain of being betrayed by someone who should love us. The guilt of betraying someone we should protect. Royal sister stories are fairy tales in reverse. Instead of sisters helping each other overcome evil stepmothers and find happily ever afters, these are stories where the sisters themselves become the villains, where family love is corrupted by ambition, where there are no happy endings, only survivors and victims. Professor Parank notes that modern retellings of these stories often try to rehabilitate the betraying sister, to show that she had understandable motives, that she was a victim of circumstance rather than a villain. This reflects our contemporary desire to understand rather than judge, to see complexity rather than simple good and evil. But Professor Parank cautions against completely excusing genuine cruelty in the name of understanding context. Cleopatra having her sister murdered in a temple, Mary keeping Elizabeth in terrified house arrest, sisters who stood by while their sisters were imprisoned or executed. These were choices, not just products of their times, and the women who made them bear some responsibility, even as we acknowledge the impossible situations they faced. Let me tell you about how these stories of royal betrayal shaped the lives of the sisters involved, often leaving psychological scars that lasted decades. According to research by Professor Linda Porter, whose work on Tudor and Stuart women examines their emotional lives, Princess Elizabeth never forgot the fear she felt in the Tower under her sister Mary's power, and that experience shaped her entire reign as Elizabeth I. She became secretive, suspicious, unwilling to name an heir, because she remembered how she herself had been the focus of plots against a ruling queen. She never married, partly because she saw what marriage had done to her sister Mary, turning her into a desperate, humiliated woman hoping for children that never came. Elizabeth's greatest political decisions were shaped by the trauma of her relationship with her sister. Similarly, according to Professor Porter, Queen Anne's relationship with her sister Mary left her with a deep sense of grievance and a determination to be different as queen. Anne promoted people Mary had opposed, took positions different from Mary's on some issues, and cultivated an image as a more English queen in contrast to Mary's Dutch husband and Dutch favourites. The sisterly betrayals of the 1690s shaped Anne's entire reign in the early 1700s, influencing everything from her religious policies to her choices of ministers. Think about living your entire life shaped by your sister's betrayal or by your own betrayal of your sister, carrying that guilt or resentment or fear into every decision you make. This is what many of these royal women experienced. Their betrayals of each other weren't just dramatic moments that made good stories. They were defining traumas that influenced the rest of their lives and often the history of their nations. Now, let me tell you about a different perspective on these stories, because not everyone agrees that we should focus on betrayal when discussing royal sisters' relationships. According to research by Professor Teresa Ehrenfeit from Seattle University, whose work on queenship examines female cooperation, we risk perpetuating stereotypes about female rivalry and cattiness if we focus exclusively on conflict between royal women while ignoring their cooperation and alliances. Professor Ehrenfeit argues that the historical record is biased toward recording conflicts and betrayals, while taking cooperation for granted or not recording it at all. Professor Ehrenfeit points to examples like Eleanor of Aquitaine's daughters, who despite complicated relationships managed to support each other at crucial moments, or the networks of correspondence and support that existed among royal women across European courts. Sisters and cousins and aunts helping each other navigate political crises, arrange marriages for children, secure financial resources. These networks, according to Professor Ehrenfeit, were just as historically significant as the betrayals, but they're less dramatic and therefore less often studied or popularized. The danger, Professor Ehrenfeit argues, is that by focusing on 11 times royal sisters betrayed each other, we reinforce ideas about women as naturally treacherous or incapable of solidarity, when in fact the historical evidence shows that royal women were capable of both betrayal and extraordinary loyalty, depending on circumstances. The question shouldn't be, why did royal sisters betray each other, but under what conditions did royal sisters support or oppose each other, and what does this tell us about the political systems they navigated? This is a fair critique, and it is worth keeping in mind as you reflect on tonight's stories. The 11 betrayals you've heard about are real and significant, but they're not the whole story of royal sisterhood. For every Cleopatra who murdered her sister, there were sisters who protected each other. For every Mary who imprisoned Elizabeth, there were sisters who interceded to save each other's lives. The betrayals are memorable because they're dramatic, but cooperation and affection were probably more common, even if they're less often recorded or remembered. Let me tell you about what these stories might mean for us today, because while you probably won't ever have to choose between betraying your sister and losing a throne, you might face situations where personal loyalty and other obligations conflict. According to research by Professor Maureen Quilligan from Duke University, whose work on women and power examines contemporary relevance of historical examples, the stories of royal sisters teach us about the corrupting influence of power and the importance of political structures that don't force people into zero-sum competition. In our world, Professor Quilligan suggests, we might think about how corporate cultures or academic environments, or even family businesses, can create situations where people who should be allies become rivals, where sibling or cousin who should support each other are instead competing for limited resources or parental favour. The dynamics aren't identical to royal succession crises, but they rhyme. The same psychological pressures, the same temptations to betray for personal advantage, the same aftermath of broken relationships and lasting resentment. The question Professor Quilligan poses is, how do we create systems that encourage cooperation rather than betrayal, that make solidarity rational rather than self-destructive? Royal families failed to do this, with catastrophic results for the sisters involved, and often for their kingdoms. But we have the opportunity to learn from their failures to build families and organizations and societies where people aren't forced to choose between loyalty and survival, where success doesn't require betraying the people who should be able to trust us most. Think about that as you drift off to sleep tonight. The stories you've heard are tragic and dramatic, full of murder and imprisonment and psychological cruelty. But they're also cautionary tales about what happens when we build systems that set people against each other, when we make competition more rational than cooperation, when we allow ambition to override every other human value, including family love. And may you remember, as you drift into dreams, that behind every story of betrayal there were real women making agonizing choices, often with no good options, trying to survive in systems that were designed to destroy them regardless of what they chose. Cleopatra, Mary, Roshanara, Zotan, and these weren't monsters. They were people responding to impossible situations, making choices that haunted them and shaped history. Their stories survive not just as gossip or scandal, but as evidence of the human capacity for both cruelty and calculation when power is at stake, and as warnings about what we lose when we let ambition destroy the bonds that should matter most. Sweet dreams, dear friends, and may your own family relationships be blessed with the loyalty and trust that these royal sisters often lacked. May you never face the choice between betraying a sibling and sacrificing your own survival. May you remember that the structures we build in our families, our workplaces, our societies, shape whether people cooperate or betray, support or destroy each other. And may you choose to build structures of trust rather than competition, knowing that the alternative is the tragic pattern you've seen tonight, repeated across centuries and cultures, whenever power becomes more important than love. Let me tell you about the Ottoman princesses and the practice of fratricide that shaped their understanding of family relationships, because the Ottoman Empire provides perhaps the most extreme example of how succession systems can make family betrayal not just common but institutionalized. According to research by Professor Leslie Pierce from New York University, whose work on the Ottoman imperial harem examines women's political roles, Ottoman princesses grew up in a system where their brothers routinely murdered each other upon accession to the throne, with the survivor having not just the right but the obligation to execute all male relatives who might challenge his rule. You can imagine what this did to family relationships. According to Professor Pierce's analysis of Ottoman sources, sisters knew from childhood that when their father died, some of their brothers would die too, strangled with silk cords in accordance with Ottoman custom, their bodies displayed as warnings against rebellion. The sisters who survived had to choose which brother to support, knowing that backing the wrong brother could mean death not just for him but potentially for them and their children as well. The Ottoman system created a situation where every succession was a bloodbath, and sisters had to navigate this by forming alliances with specific brothers while accepting that other brothers they might love would die. The betrayal here was structural rather than personal. According to Professor Pierce, Ottoman sisters who supported one brother against others weren't necessarily acting out of malice toward the brothers they doomed. They were making calculated survival decisions in a system that allowed only one winner, but the emotional cost must have been enormous. Imagine knowing that your political choice means signing your brother's death warrant. Imagine living in a harem where today's playmate might be tomorrow's strangled corpse because you supported a different faction. This was reality for Ottoman princesses from the 14th through the early 17th centuries. One specific case, according to Professor Pierce, involved the daughters of Sultan Murad III in the late 16th century. When Murad died in 1595, his son Mehmed III ascended the throne, and following Ottoman custom, had his 19 brothers strangled. the largest single act of fratricide in Ottoman history. Murad's daughters had to stand by while nearly 20 of their brothers were murdered in a single night, and some of these sisters had apparently supported Mehmed's accession, knowing what it would mean. The sister who benefited most, according to Ottoman chronicles, was A Sultan, who had aligned herself with Mehmed and his mother Safiye Sultan before the succession. She was richly rewarded with lands and influence, while sisters who had been close to the murdered brothers found themselves marginalized or even exiled from court. Think about A's choice. She betrayed her other brothers, not by actively plotting their deaths perhaps, but by accepting the system that made their deaths necessary and by benefiting from those deaths. She chose survival and power over family loyalty, and Ottoman society didn't condemn her for this, because within Ottoman logic she had simply been politically astute. But the human cost: 19 brothers dead, sisters divided by their choices of which brother to support, a family destroyed by its own succession system. This was the price of Ottoman imperial politics. Professor Peirce notes that by the early 17th century, the Ottomans modified this brutal practice, confining rival princes to the cafes cage within the palace, rather than executing them. But this created new forms of sister rivalry, as different sisters jockeyed for influence over the Sultan, and tried to ensure that their own sons or preferred nephews would eventually escape the cage and claim power. The competition among royal women continued, just with slightly less bloodshed, and sisters still found themselves on opposite sides of palace factions, betraying each other through political maneuvering, if not through outright murder. Now let me tell you about the Plantagenet princesses of medieval England, because their stories reveal that sisterly betrayal was certainly not limited to Eastern or Southern European courts. According to research by Professor John Carmy Parsons from the University of Toronto, whose work on medieval queens examines family politics, the daughters of English kings were valuable political assets, married off to secure alliances, and sometimes found themselves in situations where their marriages put them at odds with their sisters or their birth families. Consider the daughters of Henry III in the 13th century. According to Professor Parsons, these princesses were married to various European nobles and princes, creating a network of family connections across Europe. But when political conflicts arose between England and the countries where these princesses now lived as queens or nobles, the sisters found themselves on opposite sides of diplomatic and sometimes military conflicts. A sister who was Queen of Scotland might find herself obligated to support Scottish interests against England, effectively opposing her sisters who remained in England or were married to England's allies. The betrayal here was geographic and political rather than personal, but it was real nonetheless. According to Professor Parsons' analysis of medieval correspondence, these separated sisters maintained affectionate relationships when possible, writing letters that expressed continuing love and concern. But when their adoptive countries went to war with their birth countries, sisterly affection had to be subordinated to political reality. A princess who was now Queen of Scotland had to be a Scottish queen first and an English sister second, and this meant sometimes supporting policies or actions that harmed her English family's interests. The psychological strain must have been considerable. According to Professor Parsons, medieval queens and noblewomen were expected to transfer their primary loyalty from their birth families to their marital families, but emotional bonds don't always follow political necessities. Letters from medieval royal women show them torn between conflicting loyalties, trying to maintain family connections while fulfilling their political roles in their adopted countries. When they chose political duty over family loyalty, or vice versa, they were betraying someone, and they knew it. Let me tell you about Catherine de' Medici's daughters in 16th century France, because their relationships reveal how a powerful mother could manipulate her daughters' rivalries for political advantage. According to research by Professor R.J. Knecht from the University of Birmingham, whose work on the French Wars of Religion examines Valois family politics, Catherine de' Medici was one of history's great political operators, ruling France through her sons and using her daughters as diplomatic tools. She had 3 daughters who survived to adulthood: Elizabeth, who married Philip II of Spain; Claude, who married the Duke of Lorraine; and Marguerite, who married Henry of Navarre, latter Henry IV. According to Professor Next's analysis of family correspondence and diplomatic sources, Catherine deliberately played her daughters against each other, using their competition for her favour to maintain control over all of them. She would confide in one daughter while excluding others, give special privileges or information to one while denying them to another, and generally keep her daughters in states of jealousy and insecurity that made them dependent on her approval. This wasn't betrayal by the sisters of each other, exactly, but it created conditions where sisterly solidarity was impossible because each daughter saw the others as competitors for maternal affection and political support. The most toxic relationship, according to Professor Necht, was between Marguerite and her mother Catherine. Marguerite felt that her sisters had been given better marriage alliances and more maternal support, while she was married to Henry of Navarre as a political pawn in Catherine's schemes to end the wars of religion. Marguerite's memoir, analysed by Professor Necht, is filled with resentment toward her mother and more subtle resentment toward her sisters, who she felt had advantages she was denied. While Marguerite didn't directly betray her sisters in the way that Cleopatra betrayed Arsinoe, the emotional betrayal, the inability to form bonds of trust and mutual support because of their mother's manipulations, was its own form of sisterly tragedy. Think about how Catherine's manipulation poisoned her daughters' relationships with each other. By creating competition among them, she ensured that they couldn't unite against her or form an independent political alliance that might challenge her control. But the cost was that her daughters went through life unable to trust each other, unable to be the sisters they might have been in a less politically toxic environment. This is a different kind of betrayal than murder or imprisonment, but it is still betrayal, the betrayal of the potential for sisterhood, sacrificed to maternal political maneuvering. Now, let me tell you about the Japanese imperial princesses and the unique challenges they faced in a system where they could not rule but could significantly influence succession. According to research by Professor Hitomi Tonomura from the University of Michigan, whose work on Japanese court women examines their political strategies, Japanese imperial princesses in the Heian period, 794 to 1185s, could not themselves become emperors, but they could be mothers or grandmothers of emperors, and this created intense competition among sisters and half-sisters whose sons might claim the throne. The rivalry was particularly intense, according to Professor Tonomura, among the daughters of Emperor Saga in the early 9th century. These princesses were married to high-ranking nobles and court officials, and their sons became embroiled in succession disputes that divided the court into hostile factions. Sisters found themselves supporting different nephews' claims to the throne, effectively opposing each other in the complex factional politics of the Heian court. According to Japanese chronicles analysed by Professor Tonomura, these rivalries could be vicious, with accusations of witchcraft and poison, political machinations to discredit rivals, and sophisticated propaganda campaigns to undermine each other's sons' succession claims. The betrayal here was mediated through the next generation, sisters betraying each other by supporting different sons or grandsons, but it was no less real for being generational. According to Professor Tonomura, a Heian princess knew that her son's success might depend on her nephew's, her sister's son's failure, and this created impossible emotional situations where family love had to compete with maternal ambition and political calculation. Some sisters managed to maintain affectionate personal relationships even while their political interests were opposed, meeting privately to reminisce about childhood while publicly supporting rival factions. But other sisters allowed political rivalry to destroy their personal relationships entirely, becoming bitter enemies who wouldn't speak to each other and who took satisfaction in each other's political defeats. Let me tell you about the Romanov Grand Duchesses in the 19th and early 20th centuries, because even in the relatively modern period, royal sisters could find themselves in situations where political pressures threatened their relationships. According to research by Professor Greg King, whose work on the Romanovs examines family dynamics, the daughters of Russian emperors in the 1800s were married off to various European princes, and these marriages sometimes created political complications when Russia's relationships with other European powers changed. The daughters of Nicholas I, according to Professor King, were scattered across European courts, and when Russia fought wars against countries where these Grand Duchesses now lived as queens or Grand Duchesses, the emotional toll was significant. Letters between the sisters show them trying to maintain family connections while their countries were at war, trying to find politically neutral topics to write about, trying to reassure each other of continuing affection, even as their husbands and sons might be on opposite sides of military conflicts. The ultimate test came during the Crimean War in the 1850s, when Russia fought against Britain and France, countries that were allied with states where some Romanov Grand Duchesses had married. According to Professor King's analysis of family correspondence, the sisters maintained contact but with obvious strain, knowing that letters might be intercepted and that expressions of sympathy for Russia might be seen as disloyalty to their adopted countries, while expressions of support for their adopted countries might be seen as betrayal of Russia and their birth family. Think about writing a letter to your sister, knowing that it might be read by government officials looking for evidence of treason or espionage. Think about having to weigh every word to avoid giving offence either to your birth family or to your marital family, knowing that either could interpret your words as betrayal. This was the reality for many royal sisters who married into foreign courts, and it turned even the simple act of family correspondence into a political minefield, where betrayal was always possible and often unavoidable. Let me tell you about how religion complicated sisterly relationships in early modern Europe, because the Protestant Reformation created situations where sisters could be divided by faith in ways that made political alliance impossible. According to research by Professor Mary Wiesner, Hanks from the University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee, whose work on women and religion examines confessional conflict, the 16th and 17th centuries saw numerous cases of royal sisters divided by Catholic versus Protestant allegiances, and these religious divisions often proved more powerful than family bonds. We've already discussed Mary and Elizabeth Tudor, but there were many other cases. According to Professor Wiesner Hanks, sisters in German princely families were sometimes divided when one sister married a Catholic prince and another married a Protestant prince, or when religious reforms were adopted in some territories but rejected in others. These sisters found themselves not just on different sides of political conflicts, but on different sides of what both religions considered ultimate questions about salvation, truth, and duty to God. A Catholic sister might genuinely believe that her Protestant sister was damned and vice versa, making simple family affection complicated by religious anxiety and disapproval. The betrayal in these cases was often mutual, each sister feeling betrayed by the other's choice of the wrong religion, each unable to understand how her sister could make what seemed like such a fundamental error. According to Professor Wiesner, Hanks's analysis of religious correspondence between royal women, some sisters maintained affection despite religious differences, agreeing to disagree about theology while preserving family bonds. But other sisters allowed religious division to destroy their relationships entirely, with each seeing the other as not just wrong but heretical, not just a political opponent, but a spiritual enemy. Think about how absolute religious conviction could make betrayal feel like duty. If you genuinely believed that your sister's religion was leading her to eternal damnation, wouldn't you feel obligated to oppose her, to try to convert her, to prevent her from influencing others toward what you saw as spiritual death? And if she felt the same about your religion, how could you maintain a trusting, affectionate relationship? Religious division didn't just create political conflicts between royal sisters. It created situations where each sister felt that the other had betrayed fundamental truth making reconciliation nearly impossible. Now, let me tell you about the daughters of Louis V of France, and how court factions could poison even sisters who weren't directly competing for political power. According to research by Professor Christine Adams from St. Mary's College of Maryland, whose work on French royal women examines court culture, Louis V had 10 children who survived infancy, including 8 daughters. These princesses, known collectively as mesdames, had no realistic claim to the French throne and no significant political role, but they were still deeply embroiled in court factions and family conflicts. The rivalry among mesdames, according to Professor Adams's analysis of court memoirs and correspondence, centered on their relationship with their father Louis VII and on competition for influence at court. The oldest daughter, Madame Sidouvd, called Madame Première, felt that she should have precedence and influence over her younger sisters, but Louis V showed favourites among his daughters, giving some more access and affection than others. This created jealousy and resentment among the sisters, with those who were favoured lording it over those who weren't, and those who were marginalised nursing grievances against their more favoured sisters. The betrayal here was social and emotional, rather than political in the sense of direct power competition. But it was real nonetheless. According to Professor Adams, sisters excluded each other from activities, gossiped about each other to their father and others at court, formed cliques that left some sisters isolated, and generally behaved with the petty cruelty that close quarters and competition for affection can produce. When Louis XV's mistress Madame de Pompadour became the most powerful woman at court, the sisters were divided on how to respond. Some tried to befriend her to gain access to their father through her influence, while others resented her and tried to undermine her. And these different strategies created further divisions among the sisters. Think about being one of 8 sisters in a palace with no clear political role, no occupation beyond court ritual, and no power except what you could gain through personal relationships. The competition for your father's attention and for social precedence among yourselves might seem trivial compared to competing for thrones, but it was real and painful to those involved, and it prevented the sisters from forming the bonds of mutual support that might have made their limited lives more bearable. Their betrayals of each other were small gossiping, excluding, competing for favour, but they accumulated into years of dysfunctional family relationships and wasted opportunities for sisterhood. Let me tell you about how marriage alliances created situations where sisters owed loyalty to competing powers, and how this structural conflict made betrayal almost inevitable. According to research by Professor Teresa Ehrenfeit from Seattle University, whose work on medieval and early modern queenship examines marriage politics, European royal families in the medieval and early modern periods used marriages to cement alliances. But this meant that when alliances shifted or broke down, sisters could find themselves on opposite sides of military and diplomatic conflicts. Consider a hypothetical but typical situation, analysed by Professor Ehrenfeit based on numerous historical examples. 2 sisters are daughters of the King of Aragon. One is married to the King of Castile, the other to the King of Naples. When Aragon and Castile go to war with Naples, the 2 sisters are obligated to support their respective husbands, meaning one sister is supporting war against the other sister's husband and kingdom. Both sisters are being loyal wives and queens by the standards of their time, but from each other's perspective, they're betraying family by supporting enemies of their sisters' interests. According to Professor Ehrenfeit, medieval and early modern correspondence is full of letters between royal sisters trying to navigate these conflicts, attempting to maintain personal affection while acknowledging political opposition, sometimes trying to mediate between their birth families and their marital families, sometimes simply accepting that political and personal relationships had to be kept separate. Some sisters manage this balance successfully, maintaining warm personal relationships despite political conflicts. But other sisters found it impossible to separate the personal from the political, and their marriages to rival princes or kings destroyed their sisterly relationships. The tragedy, Professor Ehrenfeit notes, is that these sisters often had no choice in their marriages. They were political pawns, married off to secure alliances that their fathers and brothers had negotiated. And then when those alliances failed, the sisters were blamed for divided loyalties, suspected of being spies or traitors, caught between conflicting obligations that they had never chosen. Their betrayals of each other were often just attempts to survive in a system that had set them up to fail at maintaining family bonds. Now let me tell you about the Spanish infantas and how the unique Spanish system of royal etiquette created situations where sisters could be rivals despite having no direct political power. According to research by Professor Maria José del Rio Barredo from UNED in Spain, whose work on Spanish royal women examines court ceremony, Spanish infantas in the 17th and 18th centuries lived in a highly ritualized court where precedence and ceremony were deadly seriousness, and where disputes over who sat where or who entered a room first could become major political incidents. The rivalry among infantas, according to Professor Del Rio Barredo, often centered on these ceremonial questions, which seem absurd to modern sensibilities, but which carried real political weight in the Spanish Habsburg and Bourbon courts. An infanta who was given precedence over her sisters was signaling superior status, and that superior status could translate into better marriage alliances, more influence over their brothers who were or would be kings, and more general respect and deference from the court. So disputes over ceremonial precedence weren't just about vanity, they were about real political advantage. According to Spanish court records analysed by Professor Del Rio Barredo, sisters could spend years in bitter conflict over questions like whether the younger sister of the king had precedence over the older sisters of the previous king, or whether a widowed queen who had been an infanta should rank above or below infantas who had never married. These disputes involved elaborate legal arguments, appeals to precedent, politicking among court factions, and sometimes intervention from the king or from the pope. Sisters who were on opposite sides of these disputes could become genuine enemies, refusing to speak to each other, excluding each other from family gatherings, and nurturing grievances that lasted for decades. Think about how a system of elaborate etiquette could turn sisters into enemies over questions that seem completely meaningless from outside that system. But within the logic of Spanish court culture, these questions mattered enormously, and sisters who betrayed each other by claiming precedence or supporting their own daughters' claims over their sisters' daughters' claims were playing a political game with real stakes. Even if those stakes were ceremonial rather than involving direct power over policy or government, let me tell you about how the question of legitimate versus illegitimate birth could create bitter rivalries between royal sisters and half-sisters. According to research by Professor Sarah McDougall from John Jay College, whose work on medieval and early modern law examines illegitimacy and succession, the question of whether a princess was born in wedlock or out of it could determine everything about her future, her inheritance rights, her marriage prospects, her social status, and even her safety. This created situations where legitimate and illegitimate daughters of the same king could be fierce rivals, with the legitimate daughters seeing illegitimate sisters as threats to their inheritance and status, and illegitimate daughters resenting the advantages that legitimate birth conferred. In medieval and early modern Europe, according to Professor McDougall, illegitimate children of kings could sometimes inherit thrones if there were no legitimate heirs, or they could be legitimized by royal decree or papal dispensation. This meant that a legitimate princess might see her illegitimate half-sister not just as a social inferior but as a potential rival who might somehow displace her in the succession or in their father's affections. The rivalry was built into the system. The law and social custom told the legitimate princess that she was superior to her illegitimate sister, but the illegitimate sister's very existence was a reminder of infidelity or of the king's affections divided among multiple women. One particularly complex case, according to Professor McDougall, involved the daughters of Alfonso X of Castile in the 13th century. Alfonso had both legitimate and illegitimate daughters, and when succession questions arose, some factions argued that certain illegitimate daughters who were older and more capable should inherit over younger legitimate daughters. This created terrible divisions among the king's daughters, with legitimate daughters seeing illegitimate sisters as usurpers, trying to steal what belonged to them by right of birth, and illegitimate daughters seeing legitimate sisters as beneficiaries of arbitrary legal distinctions who weren't necessarily more deserving of power or inheritance. The betrayal here cut both ways. Legitimate daughters betrayed illegitimate sisters by treating them as inferior and by supporting laws and customs that disadvantaged them because of circumstances of birth they couldn't control. Illegitimate daughters betrayed legitimate sisters when they pressed claims to inheritance or power that legal and social custom said belonged to legitimate children. Neither side was simply right or wrong. Both were trying to survive and thrive in a system that created artificial hierarchies among the king's children and then enforced those hierarchies with legal and social power. Think about what it would do to a relationship to know that your sister, who might have grown up in the same household, might have shared tutors and nurses and playmates, was considered legally and socially inferior to you just because of which woman gave birth to her. Or think about being the illegitimate daughter, knowing that your half-sister had advantages and rights that you were denied simply because your parents weren't married. How could such a relationship not be poisoned by resentment and competition? The system created betrayal even before the sisters made any individual choices. Now, let me tell you about how sisters could betray each other through their children, supporting their own children's advancement at the expense of their sisters' children in complex dynastic competitions. According to research by Professor Elena Woodacre from the University of Winchester, whose work on queenship examines dynastic politics, royal sisters who had children often found themselves in situations where their children's interests conflicted with their sisters' children's interests, and maternal instinct could override sisterly loyalty. Consider the case of the grandchildren of Isabella I of Castile in the early 16th century, as analysed by Professor Woodacre. Isabella's daughter Juana had a son, Charles, who would become Holy Roman Emperor. Isabella's daughter Maria had children who had claims to various thrones. Isabella's daughter Catherine of Aragon, who would marry Henry VIII, had a daughter Mary who had a claim to the English throne. These three sisters' children were in competition for various European thrones, and the sisters found themselves supporting their own children's claims, even when this meant opposing their sisters' children. The competition was most direct between Juana's son Charles and Catherine's daughter Mary for influence in Europe. According to Professor Woodacre, Catherine wanted English and imperial support for Mary's eventual claim to the English throne, but Charles had his own political agenda that didn't necessarily include helping his Aunt Catherine or his cousin Mary. When Catherine found herself in need of Charles's support during Henry VIII's annulment proceedings, Charles's response was lukewarm, calculated based on his own political interests rather than family loyalty. Catherine felt betrayed, not directly by her sister Juana, who was mentally ill and powerless, but by the political system that set her nephew against her daughter's interests. Think about how maternal love could override sisterly loyalty. A mother protecting her child's interests against her sister's child's interests isn't acting from malice necessarily. She is acting from the most primal of instincts, a protection of her offspring. But the result is the same: family divided against itself, sisters betraying each other through their children, dynasties fragmenting because multiple women all believe their children deserve the crown. Let me tell you about how you might understand these 11 and more stories of sisterly betrayal in the context of modern psychology and family systems theory. According to research by Professor Terry Apter from Cambridge University, whose work on family psychology examines sibling relationships, sibling rivalry is a nearly universal human experience. rooted in competition for parental attention and resources. What made royal sibling rivalry so extreme wasn't that royal siblings were fundamentally different from other siblings, but that the resources they were competing for were so much greater: thrones, vast wealth, political power, and the consequences of losing were so much more severe: exile, imprisonment, death. Professor Apter's analysis of sibling rivalry dynamics illuminates what you've heard tonight: the favoritism that Catherine de' Medici showed among her daughters, the competition among Louis XV's daughters for their father's attention, the hierarchy among Spanish infantas based on birth order and legitimacy. All of these reflect normal family dynamics, intensified to extremes by royal circumstances. Sisters betraying each other for power weren't aberrations. They were exhibiting recognizable human behaviors under extraordinary pressure. But Professor Apter also notes that siblings are capable of extraordinary loyalty and mutual support, and that whether rivalry or solidarity dominates a sibling relationship depends on many factors, including parental behavior, family structure, and whether the siblings see their interests as aligned or opposed. The royal succession systems you've heard about tonight almost always made siblings' interests opposed. Only one could be king or queen. Only one could have primary access to power and resources. But in systems where siblings could both benefit from cooperation, they often did. The tragedy of royal sisterhood is that cooperation was structurally discouraged, betrayal was structurally encouraged, and the women caught in these systems often had to choose between family loyalty and survival. According to research by Professor Sarah Bluffer Hardy, an anthropologist from the University of California, Davis, whose work on Mothers and Others examines cooperative breeding in humans, humans evolved to be capable of both intense competition and sophisticated cooperation, often within the same family. We're not determined to be either cooperative or competitive. We're flexible, responding to circumstances. Professor Hatchadow's work suggests that the royal sisters who betrayed each other were responding rationally to circumstances that made betrayal adaptive in the sense of promoting survival and reproductive success, while royal sisters who maintained loyalty despite political pressure were also acting rationally within different calculations of costs and benefits. This doesn't excuse cruelty or make betrayal less painful, but it helps explain why otherwise normal human beings, sisters who presumably loved each other as children, who shared memories and bonds, could turn on each other so completely. They weren't monsters. They were humans in monstrous situations, making impossible choices with no good options. Think about how this psychological and anthropological understanding might change how you think about the betrayals you've heard about tonight. Cleopatra having Arsinoe killed, Mary imprisoning Elizabeth, Roshanara supporting Aurangzeb against Dara and against their father. These actions are still cruel, still tragic, but understanding them as responses to systems that made betrayal rational doesn't entirely condemn the women who made these choices. It also condemns the systems that forced those choices, the structure of monarchy that made family members into rivals, the laws and customs that gave such absolute value to being the one who ruled, rather than one of the many who were ruled. Now let me tell you about how these stories have been remembered and retold across centuries, because the way we narrate sisterly betrayal reveals as much about our own times as about the historical events themselves. According to research by Professor Carol Levin from the University of Nebraska, whose work on historical memory examines how royal women are remembered, the stories of sisters betraying each other have been told and retold with different emphasis, depending on what moral lessons each era wanted to draw. In some eras, according to Professor Levin, these stories were told as cautionary tales about the dangers of women having power, with the moral being that women are too emotional, too jealous, too focused on personal relationships to handle political responsibilities competently. Chronicles and histories written in patriarchal societies often emphasized the irrational, emotional nature of conflicts between royal women, while downplaying the very rational political calculations that actually drove their decisions. This served to justify excluding women from power. If royal women couldn't even maintain relationships with their own sisters, how could they be trusted to govern kingdoms? In other eras, particularly in more recent feminist scholarship, according to Professor Levin, these same stories have been reinterpreted as tragedies of women victimized by patriarchal systems that gave them no good choices. This interpretation emphasizes the structural constraints that royal women faced, the impossible positions they were put in, and the ways that their betrayals were often responses to male-created succession systems and political structures. This interpretation is more sympathetic to the women involved, but Professor Levin cautions that it can risk removing all agency from royal women, portraying them as pure victims when many of them were actually sophisticated political operators who made choices, even if those choices were constrained by their circumstances. Professor Levin advocates for a balanced interpretation that recognizes both agency and constraint, both personal choice and structural pressure. The royal sisters you've heard about tonight were neither purely villainous nor purely victimized. They were complex human beings making difficult choices in dangerous situations, sometimes showing remarkable courage and political skill, sometimes showing cruelty and betrayal, often showing both in the same life. Understanding their stories requires holding multiple perspectives simultaneously, condemning cruelty while understanding its causes, sympathizing with difficult choices while acknowledging their consequences, recognizing both the personal and the political dimensions of their betrayals. Let me tell you about what lessons contemporary women might draw from these historical examples of sisterly betrayal. According to research by Professor Estelle Friedman from Stanford University, whose work on women's history examines its contemporary relevance, the stories of royal sisters offer both warnings and inspiration for modern women navigating competitive environments. The warnings are about how competition for limited resources, thrones then, perhaps promotions or grants or positions now, can poison relationships between women who should be allies. The inspiration is in the examples of royal sisters who did manage to maintain loyalty despite political pressure, who found ways to cooperate even in competitive systems. Professor Friedman notes that modern women often face pressure to compete with each other rather than cooperate, particularly in male-dominated professional environments where there may be only one woman's spots available at senior levels. This creates a modern version of royal succession crises. Only one woman can be promoted. Only one can get the grant, or the award, or the recognition. So women are set in competition with each other. The question Professor Friedman poses is, will women respond as many royal sisters did, allowing competition to destroy solidarity, or will they find ways to support each other, even in competitive systems? The historical examples offer both cautionary tales and models. The cautionary tales are all the stories you've heard tonight of sisters destroying each other. The models are the less famous examples of royal sisters who maintained loyalty, who used their positions to help each other, who refused to participate in systems designed to set them against each other. Professor Friedman argues that modern women should learn from both, understanding how competition can corrupt relationships and therefore being vigilant against it, but also seeing examples of women who maintained solidarity despite pressure to betray each other. Think about how these historical examples might apply to your own life. You may not be competing for a throne, but you might be competing for promotion, for recognition, for scarce resources in your workplace, or profession, or community. The question is whether you'll let that competition destroy your relationships with other women, or whether you'll find ways to maintain solidarity even when you are in competition. The royal sisters who betrayed each other show you what happens when competition wins over solidarity. The royal sisters who maintained loyalty despite political pressure show you that it is possible to choose differently, even when the system is designed to make you betray each other. Now, let me tell you about how the experience of royal sisters might illuminate contemporary discussions about women supporting other women. According to research by Professor Joan C. Williams from the University of California, Hastings, whose work on gender bias examines what she calls the tightrope that professional women walk, women in male-dominated environments often face a choice between being seen as competent but cold or warm but incompetent. This creates a competitive dynamic where women might undermine other women to secure their own precarious positions, reproducing the same dynamics that set royal sisters against each other centuries ago. Professor Williams's research on modern workplaces, analysed alongside the historical examples of royal sisters, reveals disturbing parallels. Just as royal sisters competed for their father's favour or for the support of political factions, modern professional women sometimes compete for the approval of male gatekeepers or for the limited spots available to women in senior positions. Just as royal sisters sometimes betrayed each other by supporting different brothers or nephews, modern women sometimes betray each other by aligning with male colleagues against female colleagues. The mechanisms are different, but the underlying dynamic competition for scarce resources in systems designed by and for men is remarkably similar. The question Professor Williams poses is whether women can learn from history and make different choices. Can we recognize when we're being set up to compete with each other rather than cooperate? Can we refuse to participate in systems designed to limit women's advancement by setting women against each other? Can we build structures of mutual support rather than reproducing patterns of betrayal that have characterized women's relationships for centuries? The historical examples of royal sisters suggest both the difficulty of this challenge and its importance. Let me tell you about a perspective that complicates the entire narrative you've heard tonight, because not all scholars agree that focusing on betrayal is the most useful or accurate way to understand royal sisters' relationships. According to research by Professor Pauline Stafford from the University of Liverpool, whose work on medieval queens examines female cooperation networks, the historical record is biased toward recording conflict and betrayal while taking cooperation and mutual support for granted. This means that the 11 stories you've heard tonight, while all historically accurate, may not be representative of the totality of royal sisterly relationships across history. Professor Stafford points out that there were probably many more instances of royal sisters supporting each other than betraying each other, but support and cooperation aren't dramatic, and therefore aren't recorded as prominently in historical sources. When sisters worked together to protect each other's interests, when they used their positions to help each other, when they maintained affection despite political pressures, this often went unrecorded or was mentioned only briefly in sources that focused on more dramatic conflicts and betrayals. The bias toward recording conflict means that we probably have a distorted picture of royal sisterhood that overemphasizes betrayal and underemphasizes cooperation. This is an important corrective to keep in mind. The 11 betrayals you've heard about tonight are real and significant, but they're not the whole story of royal sisterhood. For every Cleopatra who murdered her sister, there were probably many royal sisters who protected each other. For every Mary who imprisoned Elizabeth, there were probably many royal sisters who intervened to save each other from danger. The historical record preserves the dramatic betrayals, but may have lost many examples of quieter loyalty and support. Professor Stafford also notes that even in cases where sisters did betray each other, this often wasn't the whole story of their relationship. Sisters who were political rivals might still maintain personal affection, might still help each other in non-political matters, might still think of each other as family even while they were plotting against each other politically. The complexity of these relationships, simultaneously loving and hostile, loyal and betraying, doesn't always survive in historical sources that prefer simple narratives of either pure loyalty or pure betrayal. Think about that complexity. Maybe Cleopatra mourned Arsinoe even as she had her killed. Maybe Mary felt genuine sisterly affection for Elizabeth even while she kept her imprisoned. Maybe the royal sisters who betrayed each other for political reasons still loved each other on some level, still carried memories of childhood affection, still felt guilt or regret about what politics had forced them to do to each other. The simple narrative of betrayal may miss the emotional complexity of relationships that contained both love and hate, both loyalty and treachery. Tonight, as you close your eyes and reflect on what you've learned, you might consider several layers of meaning in these stories. On the surface, they're dramatic tales of palace intrigue, of sisters turning on each other for crowns and power. But deeper down, they're stories about impossible choices, about systems that corrupted relationships, about human beings trying to survive in circumstances that gave them no good options. They're stories about how political structures shape personal relationships, about how ambition and fear can override love, about how even the closest bonds can be broken when the stakes are high enough. These 11 royal sisters who betrayed each other have been dead for centuries, but their stories still resonate because the fundamental questions they faced, loyalty versus survival, family versus ambition, love versus power, remain relevant. You may never compete for a throne, but you'll face smaller scale versions of the same dilemmas: when to cooperate and when to compete, when to prioritize personal relationships and when to prioritize other goals, how to maintain integrity and loyalty in systems that reward betrayal. The royal sisters offer both warnings and wisdom. The warning is about what happens when we let anything power, ambition, competition, destroy our relationships with people we should love and support. The wisdom is that sometimes betrayal isn't personal villainy but systemic tragedy, that understanding the structural causes of conflict can help us build better systems, that recognizing how competition corrupts relationships might help us choose cooperation instead. Sweet dreams, dear friends, and may your own relationships with siblings and with other women in your life be characterized more by the loyalty that some royal sisters managed to maintain than by the betrayals that you've heard about tonight. May you recognize when systems are designed to set you in competition with people who should be your allies. May you have the courage to choose cooperation over competition, loyalty over advancement, relationship over power, when those choices are available to you. And may you remember that even when betrayal seems rational or necessary, there is always a cost in broken relationships, in lasting regret, in the loss of what might have been if different choices had been made. Sleep well, knowing that you live in a world where the stakes are probably lower than they were for Cleopatra, or Mary, or any of the other royal sisters whose stories you've heard tonight. A world where betrayal of family doesn't usually mean murder or imprisonment, but might mean smaller cruelties and losses. Use what you've learned to make better choices in your own life, to build relationships based on trust rather than competition, to create structures that encourage cooperation rather than betrayal. The tragic pattern of royal sisterhood can end with you if you choose to make it so. Let me tell you more about the daughters of Emperor Justinian and Theodora in 6th century Byzantium, because their story reveals how even in the Eastern Roman Empire, where women occasionally wielded significant power, sisters could find themselves in deadly competition. According to research by Professor James Allen Evans from the University of British Columbia, whose work on Theodora examines her family, the Empress had several relatives, including nieces and adopted daughters, whose relationships were poisoned by competition for imperial favour and succession question. The Byzantine court under Justinian and Theodora was a place of spectacular luxury and equally spectacular danger, where a word from the Empress could elevate you to wealth and power or destroy you completely. According to Professor Evans's analysis of Byzantine sources, including Procopius's Secret History, admittedly a hostile source that must be read critically, Theodora controlled access to Justinian and used this power to manipulate relationships among her female relatives. She would favour one niece or adopted daughter for a time, giving her expensive gifts and promising advantageous marriages, only to turn against her if she showed too much independence or ambition. This created an atmosphere of paranoid competition among the young women in Theodora's orbit, with each trying to gain and maintain her favour while undermining potential rivals. The betrayals here were encouraged by Theodora herself. who apparently believed that keeping her female relatives divided and competing made them easier to control. According to Professor Evans, when one of Theodora's nieces tried to form an alliance with another relative to gain more security and independence, Theodora interpreted this as conspiracy against her power and had both women exiled. The lesson was clear: family loyalty among Theodora's relatives was dangerous. Each woman had to compete individually for Theodora's favor and could not trust even her sisters or cousins to be allies rather than rivals. Think about growing up in that environment where your own aunt or adoptive mother systematically destroyed trust among family members to maintain her own power, where reaching out to your sister for support could be interpreted as plotting against the Empress, where every gift, every show of favor was contingent and could be withdrawn at any moment if you seemed too close to another woman who might be seen as a rival. This wasn't just betrayal between sisters, it was a system designed to make betrayal inevitable, to ensure that women saw each other as threats rather than allies. Now, let me tell you about the Visigothic princesses of early medieval Spain, because their stories show that sisterly betrayal wasn't limited to more civilized or centralized kingdoms, but occurred even in the tumultuous Germanic kingdoms of the early Middle Ages. According to research by Professor Roger Collins from the University of Edinburgh, whose work on Visigothic Spain examines royal families, succession in Visigothic kingdoms was elective rather than strictly hereditary, which meant that royal daughters could influence which male relatives became king, and this created opportunities for sisters to support rival candidates and therefore oppose each other. One particularly complex case, according to Professor Collins's analysis of Visigothic chronicles, involved the daughters of King Chindasuinth in the 7th century. These princesses were married to various Visigothic nobles, and churchmen had different ideas about which of their brothers or cousins should succeed their father. When Chindasuinth died in 653, according to the sources, his daughter Resiburga supported one candidate for the throne, while her sister, whose name is lost in the sources, supported a different candidate. The dispute became violent, with supporters of the rival candidates fighting in the streets of Toledo, and the sisters found themselves on opposite sides of what amounted to a civil war. According to Professor Collins, Resiburga's candidate eventually won, and she was rewarded with increased lands and privileges, while her sister was forced into a convent, the Visigothic equivalent of political exile. The sister who lost the succession struggle spent the rest of her life in monastic confinement, praying for a brother or cousin who never became king, while her sister enjoyed the benefits of having backed the winning side. Whether the sisters had genuinely different political beliefs about who should rule, or simply made different calculations about which candidate was likely to win, the result was the same. One sister's victory was the other sister's destruction. Think about that choice. Both sisters had to choose which male relative to support in a succession dispute, knowing that choosing wrong could mean exile or worse, while choosing right could mean wealth and power. Neither could stay neutral. Neutrality in a succession crisis was itself a political position that could be interpreted as opposition to whoever won, so they had to gamble, and one sister won while the other lost everything. Was this betrayal, or just the inevitable result of a political system that forced royal women to take sides in conflicts between their male relatives? Let me tell you about the Merovingian princesses of early medieval Francia, because their relationships revealed perhaps the most violent and chaotic family dynamics in European royal history. According to research by Professor Ian Wood from the University of Leeds, whose work on the Merovingian world examines family violence, the Merovingian dynasty that ruled Francia from the 5th through 8th centuries was characterized by spectacular brutality, with brothers routinely murdering each other and sisters being caught in the crossfire, or actively participating in the violence. The most famous Merovingian royal women were queens rather than sisters competing with each other. Think of Brunhilde and Fredegund, whose rivalry dominated late 6th century Francia. But according to Professor Wood's analysis of Gregory of Tours and other sources, there were also instances of sisters betraying each other in the tangled succession disputes. and family conflicts that characterized Merovingian politics. Merovingian princesses were married to Merovingian kings or to foreign rulers to cement alliances, and these marriages could put sisters on opposite sides of the violent conflicts that regularly erupted among Merovingian kingdoms. One case mentioned by Gregory of Tours and analysed by Professor Wood involved two sisters whose names are preserved only partially in the sources. Daughters of King Charibert I in the mid-6th century. When Charibert died in 567, his kingdom was divided among his brothers, and his daughters were used as pawns in the subsequent power struggles. One sister was married to a king who received part of Charibert's lands. Another was married to a different king who received different lands. When these kings went to war with each other over territorial disputes, wars that were partly about the inheritance that had come through the princesses, the sisters found themselves on opposite sides. According to the chronicle accounts analysed by Professor Wood, one of these sisters allegedly encouraged her husband to attack her sister's husband, arguing that her sister's portion of their father's kingdom rightfully belonged to her instead. Whether this is accurate or represents hostile chronicle tradition is unclear, but it reflects the reality that Merovingian princesses could and did take active roles in the violent politics of their time, sometimes including violence against their own family members. In a world where survival often depended on your husband's military success, encouraging him to defeat your sister's husband might have seemed like rational self-preservation rather than betrayal. Think about the Merovingian world's brutality and chaos, where assassination was a normal political tool, where family members tortured and killed each other regularly, where queens were known to order murders of rival queens and their children. In this context, a sister betraying a sister seems almost mundane, just another example of the routine violence that characterized Merovingian family politics. But that normalization of family violence is itself horrifying. These were sisters who grew up knowing that family was dangerous, that love and loyalty were luxuries they probably couldn't afford, that survival required treating everyone, even sisters, as potential threats. Now let me tell you about the Chinese imperial princesses and the unique challenges they faced in a system that was in some ways even more restrictive than European monarchies. According to research by Professor Patricia Ebery from the University of Washington, whose work on Chinese women examines imperial family dynamics, Chinese imperial princesses in various dynasties faced severe restrictions on their political activity, but could still influence succession through their marriages and through factional politics at court. During the Tang dynasty 618 to 907 CA, according to Professor Ebery's analysis of Chinese sources, imperial princesses were married to high-ranking nobles and generals, and these marriages created political alliances that could be crucial during succession crises. When emperors died and succession was disputed, princesses had to choose which prince to support, often meaning choosing between their own brothers or between different nephews. The choice was complicated by the fact that Chinese princesses were expected to defer to their husbands' political judgments. So a princess might find herself supporting a succession candidate, not because she personally believed in him, but because her husband's factional alliances required it. One particularly complex case, according to Professor Ebery, involved the daughters of Emperor Xuanzong in the 8th century. When the Lushan rebellion erupted in 755, tearing the Tang dynasty apart, imperial princesses found themselves scattered across the empire, some in rebel-held territory, some in loyalist territory, and some in contested areas where allegiances shifted constantly. Sisters who had grown up together in the imperial palace in Chang'an were suddenly on opposite sides of a civil war that would kill millions of people and permanently weaken the Tang dynasty. According to Chinese sources analysed by Professor Ebery, some of these separated princesses tried to maintain contact and even tried to protect each other across battle lines, sending secret messages and trying to negotiate for each other's safety. But other princesses apparently accepted or even embraced the political divisions, supporting their husbands' military campaigns, even when those campaigns were against territory where their sisters lived. The betrayal here was sometimes structural, sisters forced by circumstance and marriage to be on opposite sides. But it was sometimes also more personal, with sisters choosing to prioritize their husband's interests and their own survival over sisterly loyalty. Think about being an imperial Chinese princess during a massive rebellion, knowing that your sister is somewhere in rebel-held territory, while you are in loyalist territory, or vice versa. Do you risk everything to try to contact her and help her? Do you accept that she is on the other side now and treat her as an enemy? Do you try to maintain some middle ground, privately hoping for her safety while publicly supporting your side's war effort? There were no good options, and any choice could be interpreted as betrayal. Betrayal of your sister if you didn't try to help her. Betrayal of your husband and your political faction if you did. Let me tell you about the Carolingian princesses, the daughters and granddaughters of Charlemagne, because their relationships reveal how even in a family that dominated early medieval Europe, sisters could be divided by political and religious conflicts. According to research by Professor Janet Nelson from King's College London, whose work on the Carolingians examines family politics, Charlemagne's family was characterized by complex relationships among siblings and half-siblings, with different mothers' children competing for favor and inheritance. Charlemagne himself had multiple wives and concubines, producing numerous children who had different claims to legitimacy and inheritance. According to Professor Nelson's analysis of Carolingian sources, Charlemagne's daughters by his various wives were raised together at the palace in Aachen, but they were acutely aware of their different maternal origins and the implications for their status. Charlemagne's daughters by his wives had higher status than daughters by concubines, and among the legitimate daughters, birth order and their father's favour created hierarchies that generated resentment and competition. The situation became even more complex after Charlemagne's death in 814. According to Professor Nelson, his son Louis the Pious inherited the empire, but conflict soon erupted among Louis's own children, and Charlemagne's daughters found themselves choosing sides in conflicts among their nephews. Some supported Louis the Pious against his rebellious sons. Others supported different factions among the grandsons who were fighting over the Carolingian inheritance. These political divisions mapped onto and reinforced older resentments and hierarchies among the sisters, turning political conflicts into family feuds. One specific case analysed by Professor Nelson involved two of Charlemagne's daughters, one of whom supported Louis the Pious while the other supported Louis's rebellious son Lothar. The sources suggest that these sisters had different political visions for the empire, one believing in maintaining Carolingian unity under Louis, the other believing that the empire should be divided among Louis's sons. But the political disagreement was also personal, with each sister seeing the other's position as not just politically wrong, but as betrayal of family interests and of Charlemagne's legacy. Think about how dynastic politics could turn even disagreements about governance into questions of family loyalty. If you believed that maintaining the Carolingian Empire intact was the best way to honour your father Charlemagne's legacy, then your sister who supported dividing the empire could seem like she was betraying everything your family stood for. But if you believed that dividing the empire among multiple heirs was the traditional Frankish way, and that imposing unity was itself a betrayal of tradition, then your sister who supported centralization could seem like the traitor. Both sisters probably believed they were being loyal to family and tradition. Both probably saw the other as the betrayer. Political conflict became inseparable from family conflict, and there was no neutral ground where sisterly affection could exist apart from political disagreement. Now, let me tell you about the impact of widowhood on royal sisters' relationships, because becoming a widow could completely change a royal woman's political position, and therefore her relationship with her sisters. According to research by Professor Teresa Ehrenfeit from Seattle University, whose work on medieval queenship examines widows, a royal widow often returned to her birth family's court or maintained an independent household. and this could create new dynamics of competition or cooperation with her sisters, who might still be married and established in their own courts. In some cases, according to Professor Ehrenfeit's analysis of medieval sources, widowed queens or princesses became valuable allies to their sisters, using their experience and sometimes their dower lands to support sisters who were facing political difficulties. A widowed queen who had no more obligations to a husband could sometimes act more independently to help her birth family, becoming a resource for sisters who needed support. But in other cases, widowed royal women became competitors with their sisters for resources from their birth families, or for influence over brothers or nephews who controlled family wealth and power. One particularly complex case analysed by Professor Ehrenfeit involved 3 sisters from a 14th century Iberian royal family. The eldest had married a king of Castile and been widowed young, returning to her father's court with significant dower lands and income. The middle sister was still married to a noble in Aragon. The youngest was unmarried and living at their father's court. When their father died, the 3 sisters found themselves in competition for their inheritance, with the widowed eldest sister arguing that her dower lands should be in addition to an equal share of their father's estate, while her sisters argued that the dower lands should be counted as her inheritance portion, since they had already received value from their father through that endowment. The dispute became bitter, according to legal records analysed by Professor Ehrenfeit, with the sisters hiring lawyers and appealing to royal courts to adjudicate their competing claims. The widowed sister felt betrayed that her sisters weren't sympathetic to her situation. She had been widowed young, had children to support, and needed all the resources she could get. The married and unmarried sisters felt betrayed that their widowed sister was trying to claim more than her fair share of their father's estate, using her situation as a widow to gain advantage over them. All 3 sisters probably had legitimate claims and real needs, but the structure of inheritance law set them in competition in ways that destroyed their relationships. Think about how widowhood could transform a sister from an ally to a competitor, or vice versa, simply by changing her legal and economic position. When she was married, her interests might have been aligned with her husband's family, and separate from her birth sister's interests. When she became a widow, especially a young widow, she might need support from her birth family, and therefore might seek to rebuild relationships with sisters. But she might also compete with sisters for limited family resources, especially if she had children who needed provision. The same woman could shift between being a cooperative sister and a competitive sister, depending on her marital status, and her sisters' responses to these shifts could feel like betrayal, even when they were just responses to changing circumstances. Let me tell you about the role of religious differences in poisoning relationships between sisters in the medieval and early modern Islamic world, because just as Christian sectarian conflicts divided European royal sisters, Sunni Shia divisions could divide Muslim royal sisters. According to research by Professor Leslie Pearce from New York University, whose work on Ottoman and Safavid women examines their religious roles, royal women in Islamic empires were expected to be exemplars of piety and could be deeply committed to particular religious interpretations or practices. When the Ottoman Empire, Sunni and Safavid Persia Shia were in conflict in the 16th and 17th centuries, according to Professor Pearce's analysis of sources from both empires, royal women who married across this religious and political divide could find themselves in impossible position. A Sunni princess married to a Safavid prince might be expected to convert to Shi'ism, or at least accommodate Shia practices, while her sisters back in the Ottoman Empire remained committed Sunnis. The religious division compounded political division, making it even harder to maintain sisterly bonds across the Ottoman Safavid frontier. According to Professor Pearce, there are records of letters between sisters on opposite sides of the Ottoman Safavid divide, trying to maintain family connections while carefully avoiding religious topics that might cause offense. These letters focus on personal news, health, children, anything except the religious and political divisions that were tearing their world apart. But other sources suggest that some sisters allowed religious conviction to override family loyalty, with sisters condemning each other's religious choices or refusing to maintain contact with sisters who had betrayed the true faith by adopting the wrong branch of Islam. Think about how absolute religious conviction could make it impossible to maintain family relationships across religious divides. If you truly believed that your sister's religious practices were heretical and endangered her soul, could you simply agree to disagree and maintain affectionate correspondence? Or would your religious duty require you to try to convert her, to condemn her choices, even to break contact with her if she refused to accept your religious truth? And if she felt the same absolute conviction about her own religious position, how could the two of you remain loving sisters when each believed the other was fundamentally, dangerously wrong about ultimate reality? Now, let me tell you about the daughters of King George III of Britain, because even in the relatively modern 18th and early 19th centuries, royal sisters could find themselves in dysfunctional relationships, shaped by their father's mental illness and by the constraints of royal protocol. According to research by Professor Stella Tilliard, whose book A Royal Affair examines George III's daughters, the 6 princesses who survived to adulthood lived what Tilliard calls lives of elegant imprisonment, confined to their father's household with limited opportunities for marriage or independent life. And this created a hothouse environment where sisterly relationships could be both intensely close and toxic. According to Professor Tilliard's analysis of the princesses' letters and diaries, George III's daughters developed complex hierarchies and factions among themselves. The eldest, Princess Charlotte, tried to exercise authority over her younger sisters, sometimes acting as a surrogate mother, but also sometimes being bossy and controlling in ways that her younger sisters resented. The middle daughters formed alliances and pairs, becoming close confidantes to each other while excluding other sisters. The youngest daughters, born when George III was already showing signs of mental instability, grew up in a family already fractured by favoritism and resentment. The betrayals here were mostly emotional and social rather than political in the grand sense, but they were real and painful to the women involved. According to Professor Tilliard, sisters gossiped about each other in letters to friends, competed for their father's attention during his periods of lucidity, and sometimes sabotaged each other's rare opportunities for marriage or court preferment. One sister might subtly undermine another sister's reputation by sharing unflattering stories with courtiers. Another might use her position as their father's favourite to deny a sister permission to travel or to receive visitors. Think about being one of George III's daughters, trapped in your father's household well into adulthood, because your father's illness and the court's concerns about royal protocol prevented you from marrying or establishing an independent life. Your sisters are your only real companions, but they're also your competitors for the limited affection and attention available in a household dominated by your father's increasingly severe mental illness. You love them because they're family and because you've shared this strange, confined life together, but you also resent them because every bit of favour they receive feels like it is taken from you, and because their very presence reminds you of the life of normal family relationships and opportunities that you've been denied. Let me tell you about the psychological concept of sibling trauma bonding and how it applies to royal sisters who grew up in dysfunctional or abusive royal households. According to research by Professor Joshua Coleman, a psychologist whose work examines family estrangement and trauma, siblings who experience abuse or trauma together often develop complex relationships characterized by both intense closeness, because they're the only ones who truly understand what they experienced, and intense conflict, because they trigger each other's trauma responses and might have developed different coping strategies that clash. Professor Coleman's framework, applied to the historical examples you've heard tonight, illuminates why some royal sisters betrayed each other with such viciousness, while others maintained loyalty despite everything. Sisters who grew up in traumatic households and many royal households were traumatic, characterized by violence, arbitrary punishment, political terror, and emotional manipulation, might have developed trauma responses that made healthy relationship impossible. One sister might respond to trauma by trying to control everything and everyone around her, becoming the kind of person who betrays sisters to maintain that control. Another might respond by becoming hypervigilant and suspicious, seeing betrayal everywhere, even when it is not intended. Yet another might respond by dissociating or becoming passive, and her sisters might interpret this as betrayal of a different kind: failure to stand up for family, failure to fight back against threats. Think about how childhood trauma might have shaped the relationships between the royal sisters you've heard about. Tonight, Mary I of England, traumatized by her mother's humiliation and by being declared a bastard, might have been psychologically unable to trust her sister Elizabeth, because Elizabeth represented everything that had traumatized Mary. Elizabeth, traumatized by her own mother's execution and by years of being in political danger, might have developed the suspicious, controlling personality that characterized her reign, partly as a response to that trauma. Their betrayals of each other might have been not just political calculations, but trauma responses, each sister triggering the other's worst fears and defensive reactions. Now let me tell you about the role of royal favourites and courtiers in poisoning relationships between sisters, because sometimes the real villains in stories of sisterly betrayal were not the sisters themselves, but the people around them who had interests in keeping the sisters divided. According to research by Professor J.H. Elliott from Oxford University, whose work on court culture examines patronage and faction, royal courts were places of intense competition for favour and influence, and courtiers often found it useful to exacerbate conflicts among royal family members to advance their own interests. A courtier who wanted to maintain influence with a queen might encourage her to be suspicious of her sisters, feeding her information, real or invented, about her sister's supposed plots or criticism. The courtier benefited if the queen became isolated from her family, and therefore more dependent on the courtier's advice and support. Similarly, courtiers might place sisters against each other, telling each that the other was trying to undermine her, in order to prevent the sisters from forming an alliance that might challenge the courtier's influence. According to Professor Elliott's analysis of various European courts, this kind of courtier manipulation was standard practice, and royal women had to be very sophisticated to navigate it. Some sisters saw through the manipulation and maintained trust with each other despite courtiers' attempts to divide them, but other sisters fell for it, allowing courtiers to poison their relationships by feeding them suspicions and resentments that might not have developed without external interference. The betrayals in these cases were still real. Sisters did turn against each other, but they were betrayals encouraged and shaped by courtiers who had their own agendas. Think about how much harder it would be to maintain trust with your sister if you were constantly hearing from people you had reason to trust that your sister was saying terrible things about you behind your back, or plotting against you, or trying to steal your position or inheritance. Even if you initially dismissed these reports, if they kept coming from multiple sources, if they seemed to fit with your sister's behaviour, wouldn't you eventually start to believe them? And if your sister was receiving similar reports about you, wouldn't she become suspicious and hostile? And wouldn't her suspicious and hostile behaviour seem to confirm the reports you'd been hearing? Courtier manipulation could create a self-fulfilling prophecy where sisters who might have remained loyal became enemies because they believed the lies they'd been told about each other. Let me tell you about the specific case of court physicians and how medical advice could become a tool for manipulation in royal families. According to research by Professor Alison Sim, whose work on medieval and early modern medicine examines court, doctors, physicians in royal courts had access to intimate information about royal family members' health and could use this information politically. A court physician might tell a queen that her sister was spreading rumours about her health, or might suggest that symptoms she was experiencing were caused by poison administered by a rival sister. In an era when medical knowledge was limited and when poison was a genuine political tool, according to Professor Sim's analysis of court medical records and treatises, royal women had reason to be paranoid about their health and about who might be trying to harm them. Physicians who suggested that a sister might be trying to poison you weren't necessarily lying. Poison was used often enough that the suspicion was reasonable, but some physicians apparently did use health concerns to manipulate royal women's relationships with their families, encouraging suspicions that might or might not be grounded in reality. One case mentioned by Professor Sim involves a 15th century Italian court where a physician told a duchess that her headaches and stomach pains were likely caused by slow poisoning, and suggested that her husband's sister, who lived at the court and had access to the duchess's food, was the most likely culprit. The duchess began to shun her sister-in-law, refused to eat anything she might have had access to, and eventually demanded that she be expelled from the court. Whether the physician genuinely believed in the poisoning or was manipulating the situation for his own benefit, perhaps he wanted the sister-in-law's rooms for his own use, or wanted to increase his own importance by creating a health crisis only he could manage, is unclear from the surviving sources. But the result was the destruction of a family relationship based on medical suspicion that might have been completely unfounded. Think about how medical paranoia could poison family relationships. If you genuinely believed your sister was trying to kill you through slow poisoning, wouldn't you betray her first, taking whatever action was necessary to protect yourself? And if your sister learned that you suspected her of poisoning you, wouldn't she feel betrayed by your suspicion, even if she was completely innocent? Medical fears and medical manipulation could create betrayals, even when neither sister had actually done anything wrong. Just the suspicion of poison, the fear of mysterious illness, the physician's suggestions about who might be to blame, could be enough to destroy trust permanently. Now, let me tell you about how dowager queens, widowed queens who had once been consorts, could affect relationships among sisters in the next generation. According to research by Professor John Carmy Parsons from the University of Toronto, whose work on medieval queens examines widowhood and power, dowager queens often became important political figures, controlling significant lands and wealth, and exercising influence over their children, and sometimes over the entire kingdom. When a dowager queen favoured one daughter or daughter-in-law over others, this could create resentment and competition that destroyed relationships among the younger women. A particularly interesting case, analysed by Professor Parsons, involves Eleanor of Aquitaine in the late 12th century. Eleanor had daughters by both her first husband, King Louis VII of France, and her second husband, King Henry II of England. These half-sisters grew up in different courts and different cultures, and Eleanor's relationships with them were complicated by political allegiances and by Eleanor's own tumultuous political career, which included periods of imprisonment by her husband Henry II. According to Professor Parsons's analysis of medieval sources, Eleanor showed clear favouritism among her children, being particularly close to some while having more distant or antagonistic relationships with others. This favouritism affected how her children related to each other. Daughters who felt favoured by Eleanor might support her political machinations, while daughters who felt neglected might oppose Eleanor and, by extension, oppose their siblings who were allied with their mother. The political conflicts between England and France, and later between different English and French factions, mapped onto these family relationships, creating a situation where Eleanor's daughters and daughters-in-law were divided into competing camps, partly because of political geography, but partly because of family favouritism and resentment. Think about how a powerful mother or mother-in-law could shape relationships among sisters or sisters-in-law in the next generation. If your mother clearly loved your sister more than she loved you, gave her better marriage alliances, supported her in disputes, showed her more affection and attention, wouldn't you resent both your mother and your sister? And if your mother pitted you against your sister, asking you to choose between loyalty to her and loyalty to your sister, What would you choose? The Dowager Queen's power and favoritism could create betrayals among women in the next generation who might otherwise have been allies, because her favoritism forced them into competition for her support and approval. Let me tell you about the specific and brutal case of the daughters of Emperor Paul I of Russia, and how his assassination in 1801 affected their relationships with each other. According to research by Professor Janet Hartley from the London School of Economics, whose work on Russian imperial history examines Paul I's reign, Paul's daughters witnessed or knew about the palace coup that killed their father and brought their brother Alexander I to the throne. This traumatic event divided the family in complex ways, with some family members complicit in the coup and others horrified by it. Paul's daughters, according to Professor Hartley's analysis of Russian sources, had different relationships with their father and different positions on his increasingly erratic and tyrannical rule. Some apparently knew about or even supported the coup that killed him, believing that his rule was dangerous for Russia and that their brother Alexander would be a better emperor. Others were apparently shocked and horrified by their father's murder and blamed their brother Alexander and the courtiers who had plotted the coup. These different reactions created lasting divisions among the sisters, with those who had accepted or supported the coup becoming close to Alexander's court, while those who mourned their father were marginalized. The betrayal here was multiple and complex. Sisters who supported the coup against their father were betraying him, but from their perspective they were protecting Russia and their brother's right to rule. Sisters who opposed the coup might have felt betrayed by sisters who had accepted or supported their father's murder, and all the sisters probably felt some degree of guilt and trauma from being part of a family that had killed its own patriarch, a trauma that might have made normal relationships impossible. Think about witnessing or knowing about your father's murder by your brother and by courtiers in a palace coup, and then having to navigate relationships with your siblings in the aftermath. Do you condemn your brother, the emperor, for parricide, knowing that this could result in your own exile or worse? Do you support him and thereby implicitly approve of your father's murder? Do you try to maintain neutrality, knowing that in the polarized post-coup environment, neutrality might be interpreted as opposition? And how do you relate to sisters who made different choices, who supported the coup while you opposed it, or vice versa? The trauma and moral complexity of the situation could make betrayal almost inevitable, as each sister made impossible choices, and then judged her sister's different choices as betrayals. Now let me tell you about the daughters of Queen Victoria, and how even in Victorian Britain, often imagined as more genteel and family-oriented than earlier eras, royal sisters could have intensely complicated and sometimes antagonistic relationships. According to research by Professor Yvonne M. Ward from La Trobe University, whose work on Victoria's daughters examines their relationships, Queen Victoria had very definite ideas about how her daughters should live and behaved in ways that created competition and resentment among them. Victoria played favourites among her daughters, according to Professor Ward's analysis of royal correspondence. She clearly preferred her youngest daughter, Princess Beatrice, whom she kept close to her as a companion, and whose marriage she delayed because she wanted Beatrice to stay with her. She had more complicated relationships with her other daughters, sometimes being affectionate and supportive, sometimes being critical and controlling. The daughters who married and left Britain for royal courts in Germany and Russia found themselves compared unfavourably to Beatrice, who remained dutiful and devoted to their mother. According to Professor Ward, this created resentment among Victoria's daughters. The married daughters felt that Beatrice was their mother's favourite despite the fact that they had made politically important marriages and had become queens and empresses in their own right. Beatrice felt that her sisters had escaped their mother's control through marriage, while she was trapped by Victoria's neediness and possessiveness. When the daughters encountered each other at royal family gatherings or corresponded about family matters, these underlying resentments surfaced in subtle digs, passive, aggressive comments, and competition for their mother's approval. The betrayals here were subtle, not murder or imprisonment, but the small cruelties of favoritism and resentment that characterize many family relationships. But they were real to the women involved, and they affected major political relationships. Since Victoria's daughters were married to the Kaiser of Germany, the Emperor of Russia, and other European royals, and their personal feelings toward each other coloured diplomatic relationships among the great powers. A slight or resentment between Queen Victoria's daughters could have ripple effects in European politics, making the personal political, even when the stakes seemed small. Think about how even a loving mother like Queen Victoria, and by all accounts she did love her daughters, even if she expressed that love in complicated ways, could create dysfunction in her daughters' relationships with each other through favoritism and control. How her need to keep one daughter close made that daughter resent her sisters who had escaped. How her criticism of daughters who had made politically important marriages made those daughters feel unappreciated and competitive for approval. The Victorian royal family might have seemed more genteel than earlier dynasties, but the psychological dynamics were similar: sisters competing for parental love and approval, resentments building over perceived unfairness, small betrayals accumulating into lasting estrangements. Let me tell you about how education and literacy rates among royal women changed the nature of sisterly relationships from the Renaissance onward. According to research by Professor Lisa Jardine from Queen Mary University of London, whose work on Renaissance women examines their education, as more royal women became educated and literate, they began to leave more extensive written records of their relationships with their sisters, including letters that reveal the complexity and intensity of these relationships. With increased literacy came the ability to maintain long-distance relationships through correspondence. According to Professor Jardine's analysis of Renaissance letter collections, sisters who married into different royal houses could stay in close contact through letters, sharing news, offering advice and support, maintaining emotional bonds despite geographic separation. But literacy also meant that betrayals could be documented and preserved. A sister's cruel words in a letter could be saved and reread, becoming permanent evidence of betrayal rather than just a verbal slight that might have been forgotten or forgiven. According to Professor Jardine, Renaissance royal sisters' letters reveal sophisticated emotional and political navigation of their relationships. They wrote to each other in coded language when discussing political matters that might be dangerous if letters were intercepted. They expressed love and resentment in the same letters, sometimes praising a sister in one paragraph and subtly criticizing her in the next. They used letters to build alliances, to gossip, to share information, to complain about husbands and in-laws, and to maintain family connections across the increasingly complex web of European royal marriages. But letters could also be used as weapons. A sister might write something inflammatory and then share the letter, or allow it to be seen by others who would spread the contents, knowing that this would embarrass or damage her sister. Letters could be intercepted or stolen and used as political evidence against the writer or the recipient. A carelessly written letter could end up in enemies' hands, revealing secrets or opinions that could be dangerous. And letters preserved for posterity mean that we know about Renaissance royal sisters' betrayals of each other in much more detail than earlier periods, because the evidence is right there in their own words. Think about how writing changes relationships. When your conflicts and reconciliations with your sister exist only in spoken words and memory, they might be more fluid, more forgiving. What was said in anger yesterday might be partly forgotten or reinterpreted today. But when your sister's cruel words are written in a letter you can reread whenever you want, the wound might never heal. When your own angry letter to your sister gets intercepted and used as political evidence against you, the consequences of momentary rage can be permanent. Literacy gave royal sisters new ways to maintain connection, but also new ways to betray each other, and new ways for betrayals to become permanent. Now, let me tell you about the role of royal mistresses in creating conflicts between sisters, because in royal courts where kings had official mistresses with political power, these mistresses could become figures that sisters had to navigate in ways that could divide them. According to research by Professor Christine Adams from St. Mary's College of Maryland, whose work on French royal mistresses examines their influence, mistresses at the French court could become powerful political figures, and royal princesses had to decide whether to cultivate these women as allies or to treat them as beneath contempt, as their official positions as mere mistresses might suggest. When King Louis XV's mistress Madame de Pompadour became enormously powerful in the 1740s and 1750s. According to Professor Adams's analysis of court sources, Louis XV's daughters, the mesdames mentioned earlier, were divided on how to respond to her. Some tried to befriend Pompadour, seeing her as a path to their father's attention and to influence at court. Others refused to acknowledge her properly, seeing her as a usurper and perhaps as an insult to their mother's memory, though their mother was still alive, just not in favour. These different strategies toward Pompadour created divisions among the sisters, with those who befriended her seen as betraying family honour by those who shunned her. According to Professor Adams, Pompadour was sophisticated enough to exploit these divisions, cultivating those princesses who were friendly to her and retaliating against those who weren't by limiting their access to the king. This exacerbated the divisions among the sisters, as those who had chosen friendship with Pompadour gained advantages, while those who had chosen to shun her were marginalised. The sisters who gained from Pompadour's favour might have felt justified in their pragmatic choice to befriend her, but their sisters might have felt betrayed, seeing the choice as selling out family dignity for personal advantage. Think about having to navigate a situation where your father's mistress has more power than you do, and where your sisters make different choices about how to respond to this humiliation. Do you befriend the mistress pragmatically, as some of your sisters do, knowing that this gives you better access to your father, but also knowing that you are implicitly accepting your family's humiliation? Do you refuse to acknowledge her properly, maintaining your dignity but also marginalised yourself, and perhaps inviting retaliation? And how do you feel about sisters who made the opposite choice? Do you see them as pragmatic and smart or as betrayers of family honour? There is no obviously right answer, but whichever choice you make will affect your relationship with sisters who made different choices. Let me tell you about how succession laws that excluded or disadvantaged women could paradoxically sometimes reduce conflict between royal sisters by removing them from direct competition for the throne. According to research by Professor Elena Woodacre from the University of Winchester, whose work on queenship examines succession laws in kingdoms where Salic law or similar customs absolutely prohibited female rule, royal sisters knew they would never be queens regnant, and therefore didn't compete with each other for the throne itself. They might compete for advantageous marriages or for influence, but not for the crown. But according to Professor Woodacre's comparative analysis, this didn't necessarily mean less conflict between sisters. It just shifted the nature of the conflict. Instead of competing to be queen themselves, sisters in Salic law kingdoms competed to be the mother of the future king, or to marry the most powerful foreign king, or to have the most influence over their brothers who could rule. And in some ways, according to Professor Woodacre, this could be even more bitter than direct competition for the throne, because the stakes were less clear and the competition was more personal and emotional rather than straightforwardly political. In kingdoms where women could rule or could pass claims to the throne to their children, according to Professor Woodacre, sisters at least knew what they were fighting for: the throne itself. The rules were relatively clear, even if succession disputes were frequent. But in kingdoms where women couldn't rule but could influence succession through their sons or could marry into foreign kingdoms and become queen's consort there, the competition was murkier. Success depended on factors like maternal fertility, sons' personalities and political skills, and the shifting factional politics of courts. This uncertainty could make competition between sisters more anxious and more vicious, because it was never entirely clear who was winning or how to win. Think about how the structure of succession law shaped what sisters competed for and how they competed. In some ways, being excluded from the throne might seem like a relief, You don't have to worry about being killed by a sister who wants your crown. But exclusion from formal power didn't mean exclusion from competition. It just meant competing for informal power, for influence rather than authority, for the chance to be remembered as the mother or grandmother of kings rather than as a queen yourself. And competition for these informal prizes could be just as destructive of sisterly relationships as direct competition for thrones. Now let me tell you about the specific case of illegitimate daughters of popes in Renaissance Italy, because the papal court presents a unique case of royal-like family dynamics without formal hereditary succession. According to research by Professor Maria Bellonce, whose work on Renaissance Italy examines papal families, several Renaissance popes openly acknowledged illegitimate children and used them as political tools much as secular kings used their children, arranging advantageous marriages and giving them lands and titles. Pope Alexander Vissi Rodrigo Borgia, according to Professor Bellonce's analysis of Borgia family documents, acknowledged several children, including his famous daughter Lucrezia Borgia and several less well-known daughters. These daughters and their half-sisters from different mothers were used in papal marriage diplomacy, married off to various Italian nobles to create alliances for the Borgia family. The relationships among these half-sisters were complicated by competition for their father's favour and for the best marriage alliances. According to Professor Bellonce, Lucrezia Borgia had a complicated relationship with her half-sisters and step-sisters, daughters of her mother's other relationships. There is some evidence that Lucrezia used her position as her father's favourite to gain advantages over her half-sisters, securing better marriage alliances and more political support for herself and her children. But there is also evidence of some cooperation among the Borgia women, particularly when they faced external threats to the family's powers. The betrayals here were perhaps less dramatic than some you've heard tonight, but they were real sisters using family position to disadvantage each other, competing for their father's favour and for resources in a family structure that was both royal-like in its power and precarious because it depended entirely on one man's position as pope, a position that would end with his death. Think about being the daughter of a pope, knowing that your position and prosperity depend entirely on your father maintaining his power, knowing that when he dies everything could be lost. In this precarious situation, wouldn't you be tempted to grab everything you could while you could, even if it meant disadvantaging your half-sisters? The precarious nature of papal family power might have made betrayal between sisters almost inevitable, as each tried to secure her own position before the inevitable fall. Let me tell you about how the practice of queenship by proxy, woman ruling in the name of absent or incapacitated husbands or sons, could create conflicts between sisters when multiple women had claims to exercise proxy power. According to research by Professor Teresa Ehrenfeit from Seattle University, whose work on queenship examines regency and proxy rule, medieval and early modern Europe saw numerous cases of women serving as regents for young or absent kings, and when multiple women in a royal family had potential claims to regency, this could create intense competition. A particularly complex case analysed by Professor Ehrenfeit involved the Trastamara dynasty in 15th century Castile and Aragon. When kings died leaving young heirs, their widows might claim the regency, but so might the young king's older sisters or aunts. Multiple women with different legal claims to authority over the young king and the kingdom would compete, each arguing that she had the best claim and the best qualifications to rule in the king's name. According to Professor Ehrenfeit, these regency disputes could become vicious, with sisters or sisters-in-law forming factions, building military alliances, sometimes even going to war with each other over who had the right to rule in the young king's name. The young king himself became a prize to be won, with rival female relatives competing for physical custody of him, because whoever controlled his person controlled his nominal authority. Sisters who in other circumstances might have cooperated found themselves as rivals for regency power, each believing she had the legitimate right to rule, and that her rivals' claims were usurpation. Think about the complex emotions involved in a regency dispute between sisters or between a queen mother and the king's sisters. Each woman probably genuinely believed she was the most qualified to rule, and that the kingdom would be better off under her governance than under her rivals. Each probably also had personal motives: desire for power, fear of being marginalized, ambition for her own children or faction. The combination of genuine conviction that you are right and personal interest in winning could make regency disputes between royal women particularly bitter, because each side felt both politically and morally justified in fighting for power. Now let me tell you about how the development of portraiture and visual culture in the Renaissance changed how royal sisters understood and presented their relationships with each other. According to research by Professor Lorne Campbell from the National Gallery in London, whose work on Renaissance portraiture examines royal representation, the 15th and 16th centuries saw an explosion in royal portrait painting, and these portraits could be used to assert status, claim precedence, or make political statements about relationships among family members. Sisters might be portrayed together in double portraits that emphasized their unity and affection, or they might each commission individual portraits that competed with each other in magnificence and implicit claims to status. According to Professor Campbell's analysis of Renaissance portraits, the details of how a princess was portrayed, her clothing, jewels, symbols, the size and prominence of the painting where it was displayed, all communicated messages about her status and power. When sisters' portraits were in subtle or not so subtle competition, this visual rivalry could reflect and reinforce political and personal rivalry. One case analysed by Professor Campbell involves portraits of the daughters of Emperor Maximilian I in the early 16th century. These sisters were painted by leading artists of the day, and each portrait makes specific claims about the subject's status, piety, fertility, and power. The portraits seem to be in conversation with each other. When one sister was painted wearing certain jewels that symbolized status, another sister might commission a portrait showing even more impressive jewels. When one was shown with symbols of fertility and motherhood, another might be shown with symbols of piety and learning. According to Professor Campbell, these visual competitions between sisters reflected real political competition, but also created new forms of competition. Once rivalry had been expressed in visual form through competing portraits, it became more public and harder to deny or resolve. The portraits became permanent records of the rivalry, displayed in galleries and palaces, where they constantly reminded viewers of the competition between the sisters they depicted. Think about how visual representation could both reflect and create rivalry. If you saw your sister's magnificent new portrait displayed prominently in the palace gallery, showing her in all her status and beauty, wouldn't you feel competitive? Wouldn't you want to commission an even more magnificent portrait that would outshine hers? And once both portraits existed, visitors to the palace would inevitably compare them, deciding which sister was more beautiful, more impressively dressed, more royal in bearing. The portraits would create a public competition that might not have existed before, or might have been more private. In this way, the development of visual culture in the Renaissance created new ways for royal sisters to betray and compete with each other, new arenas where rivalry could be expressed and preserved. Let me tell you about the daughters of James V of Scotland and I of England, and how their positions as potential brides for European princes created complex dynamics of competition and cooperation. According to research by Professor Parlene Croft from Royal Holloway University of London, whose work on the early Stuart court examines marriage politics, James had several daughters, including Elizabeth, who married Frederick V of the Palatinate and became the Winter Queen of Bohemia, and her younger sister Margaret, who died young. According to Professor Croft's analysis of court correspondence, Elizabeth and Margaret were raised in a competitive environment where their value was primarily as potential wives for Protestant princes who could cement alliances for Britain. The sisters knew they were being evaluated and compared as marriage prospects, and this created a dynamic where they were simultaneously allies as the daughters of the king, facing similar pressures and expectations, and rivals for the best marriage alliances, for their father's favour, for recognition as the most valuable daughter. When Elizabeth made her politically important marriage to Frederick of the Palatinate in 1613, according to Professor Croft, this both elevated her status. She was now married to a Prince Elector of the Holy Roman Empire, and created tension with her unmarried sister Margaret, who was still waiting for a suitable marriage to be arranged. Margaret died in 1616 before marrying, but letters from the period analysed by Professor Croft suggest some resentment between the sisters, with Elizabeth writing in ways that seem to emphasise her superior status as a married woman and princess, while Margaret apparently felt left behind and less value. Think about being royal sisters in the early 17th century, knowing that your primary value is as marriage prospects, knowing that once one sister makes a successful marriage, she has fulfilled her role, while unmarried sisters are still in waiting, still being evaluated and compared. The married sister has achieved success in the only role available to her. The unmarried sister has failed so far, even though the failure isn't her fault but is due to complex diplomatic negotiations she has no control over. How could such a situation not create resentment and competition? And how could the married sister avoid seeming to gloat when her marriage is the most important accomplishment of her life, and when court culture encourages her to emphasize her new status as a way of honoring her husband's rank? Now let me tell you about the psychological impact of being the unmarried sister in families where other sisters married successfully, because this was a common source of resentment and a kind of structural betrayal. According to research by Professor Amanda Vickery from Queen Mary University of London, whose work on women's history examines spinsterhood, unmarried women in royal and noble families often felt like failures, especially when their sisters had married and produced heirs. The unmarried sister might remain at her father's or brother's court, relegated to a secondary position, watching her married sisters gain status and recognition, while she remained in a kind of perpetual adolescence, never achieving the adult status that marriage represented. According to Professor Vickery's analysis of letters and diaries from unmarried royal women, many expressed resentment toward married sisters, feeling that their sisters had abandoned them, or that their sisters looked down on them for failing to marry. The married sisters, for their part, according to Professor Vickery, sometimes felt guilty about their married status when sisters remained unmarried, but also sometimes felt superior, having achieved the expected life course while their sisters had not. They might try to help unmarried sisters find suitable matches, but this help could feel condescending. They might try to maintain close relationships, but the status difference, married versus unmarried, mother versus childless, independent household versus dependent position, created barriers to equality in the relationships. One case, analysed by Professor Vickery, involves a late 18th century royal family where one sister married a prince and established her own household, while her younger sister remained unmarried at their father's court. The unmarried sister's letters reveal deep resentment toward her married sister, feeling that the married sister had betrayed her by building a new life and new family while leaving her behind. The married sister's letters reveal defensiveness and some guilt, but also frustration with her unmarried sister's resentment and inability to accept the married sister's new situation. Think about how marriage could divide sisters, even when there was no political conflict, no competition for thrones, no dramatic betrayal. Just the fact of one sister marrying and another remaining unmarried could create a rift based on status difference, on the married sister's achievement of expected life course, and the unmarried sister's failure, through no fault of her own, to achieve the same. The unmarried sister might feel betrayed by being left behind. The married sister might feel trapped between loyalty to her birth family and her new family. Neither is the villain, but the relationship is damaged, nonetheless by structural factors neither fully controls. And may you remember, as sleep approaches, that these stories of royal sisters betraying each other across centuries and continents are not just historical curiosities but windows into the human heart under pressure. They show you what happens when systems are designed to set people against each other, when resources are scarce and zero-sum, when survival depends on defeating those who should be your natural allies. They show you the price we pay in broken relationships, in psychological trauma, in lost possibilities for love and solidarity, when competition is valued over cooperation, when individual success requires others' failure. The patterns you've seen tonight. Sisters divided by succession laws, by religious conflict, by marriage alliances, by parental favoritism, by structural inequalities, by courtier manipulation, by simple geography. These patterns continue in different forms in contemporary life. When women are set in competition for limited positions of power or recognition, the dynamic echoes royal succession disputes. When families are fractured by favoritism or by conflicting loyalties, the emotional terrain is similar to what royal sisters navigated. When systems encourage betrayal and punish solidarity, the tragic outcomes parallel what you've witnessed in these historical examples, but you've also heard woven through these stories. Examples of sisters who maintained loyalty despite impossible pressures, who refused to let political systems destroy their personal bonds, who chose solidarity over advancement when they could. These examples are less dramatic and therefore less often told, but they're equally important. They prove that even in systems designed to promote betrayal, humans can choose loyalty. Even when competition is rational, cooperation is possible. Even when betrayal would advance your interests, you can choose to preserve relationships instead. Sleep well, dear friends, knowing that you carry forward the legacy of both the betrayals and the loyalties you've heard about tonight. May you learn from both examples, from the betrayals, what to avoid, from the loyalties, what to aspire to. May you recognize systems designed to set women against each other and refuse to participate in them. May you build structures of mutual support rather than competition. May you value relationships over achievement when forced to choose between them. May you remember that crowns and power are temporary, but the damage done by betrayal lasts generations. Good night, and may your dreams be filled with visions of sisters choosing each other over crowns, of solidarity surviving even the most intense pressures to compete, of love proving stronger than ambition. May you wake tomorrow committed to building relationships and systems characterized by cooperation rather than betrayal, by solidarity rather than competition, by loyalty rather than expediency. The tragic patterns of royal sisterhood need not be repeated. Choose differently. Good night.